Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we are not boarding a ship, and nobody in this story will die of consumption before the second act. Instead, we are going to do something quieter and, in its own way, far stranger. We are going to take an ordinary woman living an ordinary life in the present day, and we are going to let a lady from Regency England watch her live it. Not read about it. Not hear it described second-hand in a drawing room. Watch it in real time from the corner of the room with a small vial of smelling salts clutched in one gloved hand, ready for use at any moment. Tonight belongs to her. The Regency lady, powdered, laced, chaperoned within an inch of her life, raised from infancy to understand that a woman's worth was measured in her modesty, her marriage prospects, and how quietly she could suffer. We are going to hand her your Tuesday, your alarm clock, your coffee order, your bank account, your bare shoulders in July, and we are going to watch gently as 2 centuries of expectation come apart in our hands. Before we begin, thank you to everyone who requested this one in the comments. This channel exists because of ideas like yours, and it means more than you know that you keep sending them in. If tonight's journey helps you drift off, consider leaving a like or subscribing, only if you genuinely like to. No pressure, ever. We're also on Spotify now if you prefer to fall asleep through your ears alone. Link is in the description below. And for those who want the long, uninterrupted version with no breaks at all, an 8-hour ad-free edition is waiting for our members. Now, turn the lights down low. Let a fan hum somewhere in the room. Get comfortable, get warm, and let's begin. Before we step into the story, sit with a few questions for a moment. Would a woman raised in 1811 understand what it means to have a job, or would she assume you were being punished for something? Could she survive watching you scroll through the faces of strangers on a glowing screen at midnight, deciding in half a second whether you liked their smile? What would she think of you paying money to sweat in public, on purpose, in clothing tight enough to reveal the actual shape of your legs? Would she faint first at your bank balance, your bare ankles, or the sound of you laughing loudly, alone in a restaurant full of strangers? Congratulations. You have just woken up in your own bed in your own century, exactly as you always are. Nothing about you is different. But somewhere in the night, without any warning at all, a lady from 1811 has arrived in the corner of your bedroom, and she has been sitting there for some time already, watching you sleep in a bed built for 2, entirely by yourself. She has opinions. She has already in her head begun composing a letter to someone about all of this. Let's begin. We'll start where you started, your bed. You are sprawled across it at an angle no lady would consider elegant, taking up space meant for a whole family, and there is no husband beside you, no maid curled on a pallet by the door to guard your virtue through the night, no chaperone posted anywhere in the house. To the woman watching from the corner, this alone is remarkable. In her world, even a bachelor rarely knew what it was to sleep in complete privacy, and an unmarried woman was watched over like something breakable and valuable at once. That you sleep entirely alone, door locked, answerable to nobody, strikes her as either the greatest luxury a woman could ask for, or the first sign of a life gone terribly astray. She genuinely cannot decide which. Let her lean in and examine the mattress itself, because that unsettles her further. It gives evenly beneath her palm, no lumps, no straw poking through, no shifting horsehair to wake you at 3 in the morning with a jab in the ribs. In her time, a truly comfortable bed was the product of careful, expensive layering, feathers upon feathers, and only the wealthiest households achieved anything close to what you are lying on now without a second thought. Your mattress cost you perhaps 2 or 3 weeks' wages, and it supports you the way a devoted, silent servant might, asking nothing in return. She presses her hand into it, watches it sink and recover, and quietly revises everything she believed about comfort. Then there is the matter of space, and of solitude, which she finds almost harder to accept than the mattress. A household in her day was a crowded, breathing thing, servants moving through back passages at all hours, family members separated only by thin plaster walls, someone always near enough to hear you turn over in your sleep. Privacy of the kind you take for granted simply did not exist as a right. It existed, when it existed at all, as a rare and slightly suspicious indulgence. You have an entire room that belongs to you and no one else, a door that closes because you want it to, and a lock you turn without a single thought. To her, an unmarried woman alone behind a locked door, unsupervised, is the beginning of a story that ends badly. To you, it is simply where you sleep. She notices the temperature next, and this one nearly undoes her composure entirely. Your room sits at a constant, comfortable warmth, no colder and no warmer than you like it, maintained silently through the night by a small unit on the wall that you never think about. She remembers waking to see her own breath rising toward the ceiling, waiting for a servant to arrive and coax a dying fire back to life before she dared put a foot on the cold floor. You have simply never had to think about it, not once, not ever, a fact so unremarkable to you and so extraordinary to her that it's a bit like a person complaining that their private yacht is the wrong color. Now watch how you wake, because this, too, is its own small scandal. There is no bell, no servant knocking, no household stirring to life around you and pulling you along with it. A small device chimes on its own, at an hour you selected yourself the night before, and you silence it with one finger and roll over for 9 more minutes of sleep out of pure indulgence. In her world, a lady rose when the house told her to rise. You have appointed yourself the sole judge of when your day begins, and then immediately overruled your own judgment twice, purely because you felt like it. She sits at the foot of your enormous, empty bed, salt still capped, trying to make sense of a woman who sleeps alone, warm, undisturbed, and fully in command of her own morning. To her, this looks like the arrangement of a spoiled queen presiding over an unusually forgiving kingdom. To you, it's simply the 8 hours you spent unconscious before you hit snooze twice. If she is not careful, she may find herself a little envious. She would never admit it out loud. Welcome to the safest, most luxurious thing you'll do all day, and you managed it entirely unconscious. Getting dressed is next. And for you this takes less than a minute and requires the help of exactly no one. You pull on a soft, stretch-knit fabric that moves however your body moves, and that's the whole procedure. The lady in the corner is troubled on 2 separate counts. First, there is no corset, no bone stays lacing your figure into the fashionable silhouette a lady of standing was expected to maintain. Second, nobody assisted you. A proper Regency gown very often fastened at the back, in a place no woman could reach unaided, which meant a lady's maid was not a luxury but a practical necessity for getting dressed at all. Watching you clothe yourself, alone and unshaped, looks to her rather like leaving the house half-finished. Let her handle the fabric because it genuinely confuses her. She tugs at the hem and it stretches, then springs back into shape, and she nearly drops it in alarm. Cloth in her world held its form because it was forced to through bonning, through stitching, through the quiet discomfort of the woman wearing it. A fabric that simply moves with the body, forgiving every stretch and bend, feels to her faintly like cheating. You own this fabric in a dozen colors, purchased for less than the cost of a single fine bonnet in her day, and you think nothing of it. Then there is the corset she keeps expecting to see, and never does. In her world, the stays a woman wore beneath her gown did genuine structural work, shaping the torso, enforcing an upright posture that read, at a glance, as breeding and respectability. To go without them was to announce, publicly, that you had abandoned decency altogether. And yet here you are, shaped by nothing but your own body, breathing freely all the way down, bending at the waist to tie your shoes in one smooth motion that no properly boned lady could have managed without help and a moment's prayer. It's a little like watching someone win a foot race after simply declining to carry the weights everyone else agreed to wear. The speed of it all is what truly rattles her. Dressing, in her world, was a slow, layered ceremony, a collaboration between a lady and her maid, performed in a fixed and almost sacred order, and it could consume a genuine portion of the morning. You have completed the entire process faster than she could locate a single hairpin. And you did it half asleep, thinking about breakfast the whole time. She keeps waiting for the second stage, the real dressing, the lacing, and the layering. It never arrives. You're already padding your pockets for your keys, And underneath all of this is a quieter scandal she can't quite name at first, the sheer independence of it. Being dressed by someone else was never just convenience in her world. It was a mark of rank, proof that you belonged to a class of women who did not labor with their own hands. To dress yourself was, in her mind, faintly beneath a lady of standing. Watching you do it cheerfully, competently, alone, she can't decide whether you've been abandoned by your household or set free of it. If you told her you simply preferred it this way, it would take her a long moment to even process the sentence. She sits in the corner, salts in hand, watching a fully dressed woman finish getting ready in less time than it takes a kettle to boil, unassisted and unbothered. To her, you look thrillingly, dangerously undone, a lady who has skipped every single step that used to make a lady. To you, you're just dressed and running slightly late. The gap between her morning and yours is roughly 2 servants, several layers of bonding, and one entirely different idea of what a woman's body is permitted to feel like before 9 o'clock. Now let's talk about what's actually on your legs, because this is the one that nearly finishes her off. Trousers. On a woman. Walking in public. In her world, breeches and pantaloons belonged exclusively to men, and a woman photographed in them, had photography existed, would not have been making a fashion statement. She would have been committing something close to a moral offense. Ladies wore gowns, full stop, ideally something flowing and demure that whispered around the ankle. Watching you stride down the street in denim, each leg visibly and separately outlined, tells her that the entire natural order of things has quietly come apart while she slept. Let her circle you slowly, taking in the full scope of it. The fabric clings to each leg individually, confirming visibly, undeniably, that you have 2 of them, a fact her own clothing was specifically engineered to blur into one soft, ambiguous column. The shape of a woman's legs was, in her world, a private matter, hinted at through fabric, never confirmed outright. You have confirmed it in broad daylight in blue denim while holding a paper cup of coffee. She looks around, half expecting a crowd to gather in horror, and finds only other trousered people going about their day without a glance in your direction. Consider what trousers meant to her beyond the fabric itself, because that's where the real weight of the thing lives. Breeches were, symbolically, the uniform of male authority, the freedom to ride, to labor, to move through the world unencumbered by yards of fabric. There was even an old phrase, wearing the breeches, used to mock any household where the wife held more sway than her husband. And here you are, wearing actual breeches without a flicker of shame, and by every appearance holding quite a bit of authority in your own life. The garment and the metaphor have folded into one, and she finds it almost too pointed to bear. Then there is the practicality of it all, which she cannot help but notice, however grudgingly. You take the stairs 2 at a time. You crouch to pick something up off the floor without a second thought. You step over a puddle without recalculating how much fabric you're at risk of ruining. In her world, a strong gust of wind was a minor emergency, and a puddle a genuine tactical problem. You don't even look down. It's rather like watching someone walk casually through a doorway she spent her whole life being told was a solid wall, and the sheer volume of it undoes her a little further. You don't own a single daring pair as some kind of experiment. You own several in different colors and weights for different occasions, and not one of them raises an eyebrow anywhere you go. She keeps bracing for the scandal, the disapproving ant, the whispered ruin. None of it comes. There is no ant. There is only you, comfortable, mobile, and, as far as anyone around you is concerned, entirely respectable, dressed in the one garment her world swore would end a woman's reputation the moment she put it on. She retreats to her corner, salts uncapped but unused, watching a perfectly respectable woman walk down a public street in what her own century would have called menswear, while the world declines entirely to end. You wear the breeches now. Everyone does. She's going to need a moment to sit with that. Since we're on the subject of legs, let's talk about how much of yourself you show without thinking twice. On a warm day, you'll wear shorts, or a skirt that stops well above the knee, and you'll walk through a crowded street in full daylight without a flicker of self-consciousness. To the lady watching, an exposed ankle was already a small thrill in her day, the kind of glimpse that could genuinely fluster a gentleman across a ballroom. A bare knee, a bare thigh, an entire leg in full sun on a public street, is so far outside anything she understands that her first assumption is that some accident has befallen the lower half of your dress. Let her take it in slowly, because the geography alone overwhelms her. She starts at the ankle, the old frontier, the daring edge that a lifted hem might once have revealed to a lucky bystander. Her eyes travel upward, past the shin, past the knee, and she genuinely has to sit down. That entire stretch of leg lived, in her world, only in the realm of the deeply private, spoken of rarely, seen almost never, imagined constantly by people who would never say so aloud. You have simply put it in the sun because the weather was warm and shorts were the sensible choice. Consider the effort her generation invested in concealment, because it clarifies just how far you've traveled from it. Hems were long by careful design. Petticoats guarded against the treachery of a strong wind. A woman managed her skirts constantly, sitting, rising, climbing stairs, in a kind of lifelong performance of never accidentally revealing what she wasn't meant to reveal on purpose. You have simply abolished the performance. There is nothing left to manage, nothing to guard, because you revealed it all deliberately the moment you left the house, and then promptly forgot about it. And nobody around you reacts, which is the detail she keeps snagging on. In her imagination, this much exposed leg should summon a scandalized crowd, a fainting chaperone, a gentleman shielding a child's eyes. Instead, the street simply flows around you, other bare legs moving past in both directions, utterly unremarkable. The exposure she was raised to see as ruin has become so ordinary here that no one even registers it. It's a little like discovering that the terrible secret you guarded your whole life turned out elsewhere, to be nothing more than the weather. She keeps searching your face for the shame that should logically accompany all this exposed skin, and she cannot find it anywhere. You aren't blushing. You aren't hurrying. You aren't apologizing to passers-by or pretending it was somehow an accident. You're simply comfortable, cool in the heat, and mildly pleased with how the sun feels on your legs. To her, comfort was never permitted to outrank modesty. To you, the two were never even competing. If it's warm outside, you dress for warm, and your legs are simply part of you, not a scandal you happen to be carrying around below the waist. So she sits, salts in hand, watching you stroll through a sunny afternoon with an entire leg cheerfully on display while the world remains, stubbornly, entirely upright. To her, you are either the victim of a wardrobe catastrophe or the boldest woman she has ever laid eyes on. To you, you checked the weather and dressed accordingly. The ankle that once stopped a gentleman mid-sentence has become, in your century, the least interesting thing about you. And she isn't yet sure whether that's a tragedy or the most restful idea she has ever encountered. Let's follow you outside, where you do something she finds close to unhinged. You lie down deliberately in direct sunlight, wearing very little, for the express purpose of making your skin darker. To the lady in the corner, pale skin was the entire point of being a lady. A milky, untouched complexion meant you were wealthy enough to remain indoors, shielded by parasols and wide-brimmed bonnets, spared the vulgar labor of the fields. A tanned woman was a woman who worked outdoors, and no lady of standing wanted to be mistaken for one. Watching you spend money to travel somewhere hot purely to roast yourself golden, she concludes, with real bewilderment, that you are deliberately trying to look poor, which strikes her as one of the strangest ambitions a person could have. Let her walk through the logic of her own world, because in its own context it was entirely sound. The sun was the enemy of status. It browned the skin of the laborer, the farmhand, the woman with no choice but to work beneath it. A lady armored herself against it with parasols, gloves, wide brims, and a devotion to shade bordering on the religious. Pale skin was visible proof, worn right on the face, that you did not have to work outdoors. You have taken that very proof and laid it out to cook. Now watch what you actually do, which compounds the offense magnificently in her eyes. You don't merely allow the sun to touch you, you seek it out. You lie beneath it for long stretches, turning at intervals, checking your progress with something close to satisfaction. In her world, this posture belonged to a woman being punished by circumstance. In yours, it's a reward you saved for, planned around and often photographed. She keeps waiting for you to leap up in horror and dash for shade. Instead, you reach for more oil, inviting in the very thing she spent her whole life avoiding. Consider the money, because that's where she truly loses the thread. You didn't simply step outside, you traveled, at real expense, somewhere hotter and sunnier than home, for the specific purpose of becoming browner. In her era, spending a fortune to resemble someone who'd been laboring in a field all summer would have seemed like a nobleman paying good money to be mistaken for a stable hand. Wealth, to her, displayed itself through leisure made visible as paleness. In your world, wealth displays itself through leisure made visible as color. Same fortune, opposite skin, and the meaning has flipped entirely somewhere across 2 centuries, and the language you use for it undoes her further still. You call it a holiday, a glow, a healthy color. Healthy, she would have called the very same shade evidence of hardship. You come home darker, and everyone around you says you look wonderful, rested, expensive even. The exact complexion that would have quietly lowered her standing in a drawing room now quietly raises yours in your own circle. It's the same sun, the same skin, and an entirely different scorecard, and she cannot get the 2 centuries to agree on which way is up. She stands at the edge of your sunlit patch of grass, parasol raised out of pure habit, watching a wealthy woman pay good money to resemble, temporarily, the poor. To you, you're simply topping up your tan before summer ends. The pale skin she guarded like an inheritance has become, in your world, almost beside the point. She lowers the parasol just slightly and feels the warmth on her own skin. She will not admit out loud that it's rather pleasant. Now your hair. You've done something drastic to it and seem thoroughly pleased with the result. You've had it cut quite short, sitting in a chair the entire time scrolling idly on your phone. In her era, a woman's long hair was treated as one of her quiet glories, arranged, curled, and pinned with real care for every occasion that called for it. Short hair on a woman in her world generally meant one of 3 things: illness, punishment, or scandal. Something done to a woman, never something a woman simply chose for herself. That you selected this, paid for it, and consider the result marvelous sends her hand straight back toward her reticule for the salts. Let her mourn the hair first, because to her a genuine loss has occurred. Long hair in her world was a slow inheritance, grown patiently over years, brushed and tended each night, unpinned only in the most private of settings. It signaled patience, health, the whole approved picture of femininity. To cut it away was to discard something that could not simply be regrown by next season. Nobody threw away a treasure like that without a serious reason, and she scans your face for the tragedy behind the decision. You show her, instead, a photograph on your phone of the exact style you requested. Consider the situations in which a woman lost her hair in her world, because none of them were happy ones. Illness, where hair was cropped to help fight a fever or because a bedridden woman simply couldn't manage it. Punishment, where a woman's hair was cut publicly as a form of shamming. And scandal, where a fallen woman's cropped head advertised her ruin to anyone who looked. Short hair told a story in her world, and the story was never a good one. Your short hair tells no story at all beyond the fact that you were tired of the upkeep the longer version required. She waits for more. There is no more. Watch, too, the casual manner in which the whole thing happened, because that multiplies the shock considerably. There was no agonizing, no grieving, no family council convened to discuss it. You sat in a chair. A stranger snipped away what she would have considered years of careful glory, and you looked at your phone the entire time, faintly bored. Then you paid, tipped generously, and walked out feeling lighter and rather pleased with yourself. In her mind, a scene like this should involve tears, or at minimum a solemn occasion marked by some ceremony. Instead, it carried roughly the emotional weight of trimming a hedge, and you were delighted with the results. And the silence afterward baffles her most of all. She braces for whispers, for raised eyebrows, for the quiet withdrawal of invitations that a scandal of this size would once have guaranteed. Instead, your friends compliment it. Strangers admire it in passing. Nobody assumes illness, disgrace, or ruin. The entire coded language of women's hair that she could once read as fluently as a second alphabet has simply been erased, and no one thought to warn her. You just have a haircut you like. That is the whole of the meaning. There isn't a hidden second layer to find. She sits, salts in one hand, an imagined long braid clutched in the other, watching a woman who cheerfully discarded what her century treated as a crown and gained nothing for it but convenience and compliments. To her, you've thrown away a fortune and escaped every consequence, which by her rules should not be possible. To you, it's simply easier in the mornings. And it happens to suit your face. She touches her own carefully pinned hair and for one dangerous moment wonders what it might feel like to be that light. Now let's watch you at the mirror, applying color deliberately to your lips, your cheeks, your eyelids, in full daylight, in plain view of anyone passing your window. The lady flinches visibly. In her time, obvious cosmetic paint on a woman's face was deeply suspect, associated far more with actresses and women of a certain reputation than with respectable ladies. The fashionable ideal of her day was to appear naturally, effortlessly lovely, and any assistance toward that end had to remain invisible, denied if pressed. That you announce, openly and cheerfully, that yes, this is makeup, yes, you bought it, and yes, you rather enjoy the ritual of applying it, strikes her as a confession no proper lady would ever make aloud. Let her sit for a moment with the ideal she was raised on, because it depended entirely on secrecy. A lady was meant to look as though her complexion had simply arrived that way, courtesy of good breeding and fortunate genetics. Any enhancement had to be hidden, whispered about at most, denied outright if anyone dared to ask. Visible paint announced that a woman was performing, and performance belonged squarely to the stage, never to the drawing room. You are performing openly at a well-lit mirror, narrating each step aloud as though it were a craft worth being proud of rather than a secret worth burying. Consider who wore obvious cosmetics in her world, because the list still makes her wince. Actresses whose faces had to project all the way to the back of a candle-lit theater. Women who sold their company for a living, whose bright cheeks and reddened lips served as a kind of advertisement. To a respectable lady, heavily visible paint functioned almost like a signal flare, and not the sort of signal she wanted anywhere near her own name. So when she watches you draw bold, unmistakable color across your eyelids in the plain light of morning, some old alarm bell in her rings faintly, insisting that a certain kind of woman must be getting ready for something. Then you head off to your entirely respectable job. The alarm bell, quite understandably, grows confused. Now notice the sheer abundance you work with, which she finds almost obscene in its openness. Small pots and tubes and pencils in colors that make no attempt whatsoever to mimic nature. Blues and golds and deep reds that announce themselves the moment you walk into a room. In her world, even the illicit cosmetics were engineered to fake a natural blush convincingly. Yours don't pretend to be anything but paint, and seem rather delighted about it. A stripe of bold color across your eyelid isn't pretending to be skin. It's declaring itself paint and nothing else, and the honesty of that is a genuinely novel idea to her. And your respectability survives the whole ordeal, which is the true miracle from where she's sitting. You paint your face with the boldness of a stage performer, and then move through your entire day as an unquestionably respectable woman greeted warmly, taken seriously, judged not in the slightest for the color on your cheeks. The link she believed unbreakable between visible paint and questionable character has simply snapped clean in half. Cosmetics have become a craft, a hobby, a form of daily play cut loose from shame entirely. You wear it to work, to weddings, to nothing in particular at all, and no one reaches for a verdict about your morals. She stands behind you at the mirror, salts entirely forgotten, watching a respectable woman apply bold, unapologetic color to her own face in broad daylight and lose absolutely no standing whatsoever for it. To her, you've taken the mask of the stage and worn it directly into polite society and been welcomed regardless. To you, you simply like how it looks, and this season the reds are especially good. She peers closer at your eyeshadow, tilts her head, and quietly, privately, admits that the gold is really rather striking. Here's one that requires her a genuine moment to process. You have a small image permanently etched into your shoulder, and several thin metal rings threaded through your ears. In her world, marking the body itself, rather than adorning it with jewelry that could be removed at will, belonged to sailors, laborers, and people living at the very edges of respectable society. A lady's status was displayed through what she could take off at the end of the evening. That you have chosen to write something permanent onto your own body, and think it rather beautiful, sits somewhere between fascinating and unforgivable in her mind. Let her grasp the distinction that her entire understanding of finery rested upon. A lady's adornment was by design removable, jewels fastened on and unfastened again, gloves drawn on and peeled away, hair ornaments pinned in and pulled free. The wealth lived in the objects themselves, which could be sold, inherited, or set aside entirely. What made adornment respectable in her mind was precisely the fact that it was never truly part of the woman wearing it. Your shoulder cannot be taken off. It is in you, permanently, and that permanence flips the entire meaning from finery into something she associates instead with the docks. Consider who bore permanent markings in her world, because the list troubles her. Sailors returning from distant voyages, carrying strange ink beneath the skin picked up in foreign ports. Laborers and outcasts, people marked by circumstance and hard trade rather than by deliberate taste. A permanent mark signaled to her a hard and lowly existence, never an ornament of refinement. So when she studies your small, carefully chosen design, worn with evident pride, her first instinct is to place you among the roughest company she can imagine. Then she notices your soft hands and your comfortable, unhurried life, and the instinct short-circuits entirely. Then there are your ears, which trouble her along an entirely different line. Not a single modest piercing, but several small rings marching along the edge of the ear itself. Each hold a small, permanent decision. In her day, one discreet piercing for a fine earring might have passed without comment. Multiplying the holes, treating your own ear as a canvas for hardware, reads to her as excess bordering on the untamed. You had each one done deliberately, sometimes on a passing whim, and you swapped the little rings in and out as casually as she might change a pair of gloves. The removable part she understands perfectly well. It's the permanent holes underneath that unsettle her. And once again, respectability holds, which is the thread she keeps pulling at in disbelief. You have marked and pierced your body in ways her world associated with the margins of society, and yet you sit comfortably at the center of yours, employed, welcomed, admired even. The permanent mark that would once have quietly barred a woman from every respectable drawing room in the county is in yours, simply a small piece of personal expression that people ask about warmly. The whole neat hierarchy of removable finery, so obvious and so rigid to her, has quietly dissolved. You wear your decoration in your own skin, and your skin is respected all the same. She peers again at the small design on your shoulder, salts drooping forgotten in her grip, studying a respectable woman who chose to be permanently, deliberately marked and lost no standing whatsoever for it. To you, it's just a small piece of art you liked enough to keep forever, and a few earrings you rotate for fun. She admits quietly that it's actually rather fine work. Let's follow your morning routine a little further, because next you do something she finds almost impossible to explain in any terms her world provided her. You put on the tightest clothing you own yet, travel to a special building filled with strange metal contraptions, and then you strain and heave and sweat until your face flushes red, all for no wages, no harvest, and no emergency of any kind. In the Regency world, visible exertion and visible perspiration were things a lady avoided at nearly any cost. Delicacy was prized above almost every other quality, and a woman who overexerted herself in public was thought to be risking both her health and her dignity in a single stroke. Watching you pay money to exhaust yourself entirely on purpose, she genuinely wonders what terrible thing you might be running from. Let her study the building itself, because everything about it confounds her expectations. It is full of heavy metal objects clearly designed for labor, and yet no goods of any kind are produced inside it. No crop is harvested. No cart is loaded. No useful work of any recognizable kind leaves the premises at the end of the day. People lift the heavy things, set them back down, and lift them again, gaining nothing from the exercise but heavier breathing and a flushed complexion. In her world, heavy lifting was the burden of the laboring classes, endured for a wage and avoided eagerly by anyone with the means to avoid it. Here, people have paid an actual fee for the privilege of that same burden, and they thank the establishment afterward as though they've received a gift. Consider the clothing, too, which offends her sense of propriety all over again, in a slightly different key than before. You have chosen your tightest, most revealing garments specifically for this activity, fabric that clings and stretches and leaves very little of your shape to anyone's imagination. In her day, physical exertion demanded that modesty be doubled, never abandoned. And yet here the entire room has dressed itself for movement above every other consideration, bodies plainly on display, everyone far too absorbed in their own effort to spare a glance at anyone else's. The delicacy she was raised to protect at all costs has been quietly set aside here in favor of something she can only describe as purposeful, deliberate sweating. Now the sweat itself, which was very much her old enemy. A lady in her world was meant to remain composed, cool, and dry at all times, or at the very least to disguise any lapse behind a fan and a dusting of powder. Visible perspiration in public suggested distress, poor breeding, or illness of some kind. You are drenched, deliberately and rather cheerfully, wiping your face with a small cloth you thought to bring precisely because you knew this moment was coming. You planned to sweat. You dressed for it. You traveled here for it. And you consider the resulting drenching a mark of a successful session rather than an embarrassment to be hidden. To her, you look like a woman in the grip of a fever. To you, it's simply a good workout, and you feel wonderful afterward. And the complete absence of any external reward is what truly defeats her attempts at understanding. There is no wage waiting for you at the end of it, no harvest brought in, no task completed on anyone's behalf but your own. You strain and heave and exhaust yourself entirely, and then you simply go home, having produced nothing tangible but tiredness and a strange, satisfied glow. In her world, effort of this kind was always a cost paid toward some external gain. You have made the effort itself the entire point, exhaustion purchased and pursued for its own sake. The product and the goal collapsed into one and the same thing. That a body might be strengthened deliberately, purely for its own sake rather than merely spent in someone else's service, is a genuinely new idea to her. So she stands among the strange metal machines, salts hanging limp and forgotten in one hand, watching a perfectly respectable woman pay good money to labor like a field hand, in tight clothing, dripping with sweat, for no wage and no emergency whatsoever. To her, you are either fleeing some unnamed terror or you have entirely lost your grip on the dignity that leisure was supposed to represent. To you, it's just your workout, and it keeps you feeling strong and clear-headed for the rest of the day. She watches you finish, glowing and visibly pleased with yourself, and privately, quietly, wonders whether all the avoiding she did in her own lifetime ever actually did her any real good. Now here is something she almost envies outright, once the initial shock of it fades. You step into a small tiled room, turn a single handle, and warm, perfectly clean water simply pours over your entire body without a single servant lifting a finger to arrange it. And you do this every single day, sometimes even twice. In the Regency era, a full bath was a genuine production. Servants hauled water and heated it over the hearth in batches, carried it upstairs bucket by bucket, and even in wealthy households the whole body was not bathed nearly as often as you might assume. Most people instead relied on frequent changes of clean linen worn close to the skin to stay presentable between the occasional proper bath. That you drench yourself completely, every morning without a single servant's back aching for the privilege, looks to her like the luxury of a queen, handed out to absolutely everyone without exception. Let her marvel at the water first, because to her it arrives like a genuine small miracle. She watches you turn a handle, and warm, clean water simply appears, as hot as you like it, with no fire lit anywhere, no bucket carried up any stairs. In her world, water was hauled from a well or a pump, heated slowly over a hearth, and poured carefully into a tub that began cooling the moment you stepped into it. It was heavy, slow, and genuinely precious, and every drop represented real labor behind it. You produce a warm downpour with a simple flick of your wrist, use exactly as much as you please, and let the rest run harmlessly away. She very nearly weeps at the sheer extravagance of it. Consider what a proper bath cost her own household in effort, because that is the true measure of the luxury you're standing inside right now. It meant servants hauling water again and again, heating it in careful batches, filling a tub that cooled steadily the longer you sat in it, all for a single wash that could not simply be repeated the following morning without enormous additional effort. Because it demanded so much labor, it was not done often, and cleanliness was instead maintained through fresh linen, changed regularly to keep a person presentable between these rarer, more elaborate occasions. Bathing the whole body was, in her world, an event. You have turned the event into a habit so ordinary you scarcely register it happening at all. Now watch the frequency, which is the detail that astonishes her most thoroughly. Not once a week, not reserved for special occasions. Every single morning, and sometimes again in the evening if you've been to that strange sweating building earlier in the day. In her world, this much bathing would have marked you as impossibly grand, or perhaps as someone nursing a rather strange private obsession. She keeps expecting you to treat each bath the way she would, as a luxury to be savored, an occasion made of it. Instead, you do it half asleep, thinking about your schedule for the day, treating what her century would call a duchess's indulgence as the single least remarkable part of your entire morning. And no one suffers for it, which reframes the whole matter for her completely. There is no exhausted servant standing behind your daily downpour, no one hauling and heating water on your behalf, no cost paid in someone else's aching shoulders. The luxury that once required an entire household's coordinated labor now requires only that you reach out and turn a handle, and it has, as a result, been handed to absolutely everyone, grand and humble alike, with no distinction drawn between them. In her world, this degree of cleanliness was a genuine privilege of rank. In yours, it is simply expected, available to all, and attached to no one else's suffering whatsoever. That last part is the piece she cannot stop turning over in her mind. She stands at the edge of your small tiled room, salts entirely forgotten somewhere in her lap, watching warm, clean water pour freely over a woman who considers it the dullest part of waking up. To her, you bathe daily like royalty, effortlessly, guiltlessly, with no servant's body broken to make it possible. To you, it's just your shower, and you're already thinking about what to have for breakfast. She admits, finally, that this is the 1 century she would take for the hot water alone. Let's take you out now for your morning drink, because this is where her pulse genuinely begins to quicken. You walk into a busy, crowded establishment entirely on your own, order something elaborate, and sit down contentedly among total strangers. In her world, coffee houses were largely the territory of men, spaces built for business, for politics, for loud opinions exchanged over newspapers, and a respectable woman certainly did not stroll into one unaccompanied to sit quietly with her own thoughts. That no one stops you, questions you, or hurries off to fetch a male relative to collect you tells her that the world has become either very safe indeed, or very strange, and she rather suspects it might be both at once. Let her stand a moment in the doorway, bracing herself for the room to fall silent at your entrance the way it certainly would have in hers. These were rooms thick with men's conversation, ledgers spread open on tables, newspapers rustling, the confident noise of people who assumed without question that the space belonged entirely to them. You cross the threshold and nothing whatsoever happens. No head turns your way. The room simply absorbs you without comment, as though a woman sitting alone were the single most ordinary sight it had ever witnessed. Which, of course, it is. Consider the drink you order, too, because it bewilders her before you've even found a seat. In her day, coffee was coffee, dark, plain, and faintly bitter, taken without much ceremony. You request something with layers, a long and highly specific list of instructions involving temperature, milk, syrup, and foam, delivered fluently and without a trace of embarrassment. The young person behind the counter writes it all down as though it were perfectly reasonable, which apparently in this world it is. She marvels that a woman may not only enter this masculine room but issue such detailed demands within it, and have them cheerfully fulfilled for the price of a few coins. Now watch you settle in, because this is the part she finds nearly transgressive on its own. You don't gulp the drink down and hurry off the way a woman with somewhere urgent to be might. You choose a seat, arrange your things, and simply stay, doing nothing in particular but existing quietly in public with your own thoughts for company. In her world, a respectable woman abroad was always going somewhere specific, always accompanied, always accountable to someone for her whereabouts. To sit alone, unhurried, occupying a table purely for the pleasure of it, was a freedom reserved almost entirely for men who had nowhere pressing they needed to be. You have claimed that same freedom without ever once noticing it had been withheld from women like her. She keeps waiting, tensely, for the danger the situation clearly implies, the loss of reputation, the whispered scandal, the male relative summoned urgently to rescue you from your own recklessness. But there is no danger visible anywhere in the room. You sit among strangers, entirely unguarded and entirely fine. Other women sit alone at other tables doing precisely the same thing, and the whole room hums along peacefully around all of you. The vulnerability she was taught to fear above nearly everything else, the reason a lady never went anywhere alone, has quietly faded into something closer to background noise, letting you sit in public as calmly as you might sit at home. She pulls out the chair across from you, salts untouched in her lap, watching a respectable woman occupy what was once a man's exclusive territory, entirely at ease and entirely unbothered. To her, you have wandered fearlessly into a room she was forbidden even to enter, ordered something practically baroque, and then had the audacity to simply relax there. To you, it's just coffee before work, a small pocket of quiet you happen to enjoy. She eyes your elaborate cup with open curiosity, and despite herself, wonders exactly what they put in it. Let's talk about your language now, because you've just stubbed your toe rather badly and said something that would have gotten a Regency lady banished from 3 drawing rooms simultaneously. You swear casually, cheerfully, in mixed company, often for pure emphasis rather than any real distress. In her time, refined speech was a genuine mark of good breeding, and coarse language in a lady's mouth was considered shocking evidence of low character. A lady expressed distress with a delicate gasp, perhaps a convincing feint if the situation truly called for it, never with the word you just used about a piece of furniture. She waits, tensely, for the heavens to respond in some visible way. They do not respond at all. This, more than almost anything else so far, genuinely unsettles her. Let her sit for a moment with what refined speech represented in her world, because it functioned as both armor and advertisement at once. The way a woman spoke announced her breeding as plainly as her gown did careful vocabulary, gentle phrasing. A practiced aversion to anything coarse, all of it signaling that she had been raised properly, sheltered from rough company, and was therefore worthy of respect. Coarse words did precisely the opposite, marking a woman as low, unguarded, exposed to a rougher sort of life than a respectable family would wish for its daughters. So your casual cursing lands on her ear like a lady loudly announcing her own ruin over a stubbed toe, and then simply carrying on with her afternoon entirely unbothered by the announcement. Consider the range of your swearing, too, because she finds its sheer variety genuinely bewildering. You don't only curse in pain or in anger, which she might at least understand as an understandable lapse under real strain. You curse for emphasis, for humor, for simple affection, dropping a sharp word into an otherwise friendly sentence the way she might place a flower into a vase for decoration. The coarse words that belonged, in her world, strictly to the gutter and the tavern have become, in your mouth, something close to ordinary punctuation. You use them to season a good story, to make a friend laugh harder, to underline your own delight at something. Delight, curse it at, she genuinely cannot place that combination anywhere within her own rules. Now the mixed company, which multiplies her alarm considerably. It's one thing, perhaps, for a woman to slip occasionally in speech among her most trusted intimates, but you swear in front of men, in front of near strangers, in front of people whose good opinion in her world a woman was meant to guard above almost everything else she possessed, and those men do not recoil in the slightest. They laugh or agree or curse right back at you, treating your language as the easy, common tongue of equals rather than the disgrace of a fallen woman. The careful performance of feminine refinement that she rehearsed her entire life has simply been set down here, and no one has ever asked you to pick it back up again. And still the heavens hold their peace, which is perhaps what rattles her most thoroughly of all. In her imagination, this much coarse language from a woman ought to summon real consequences, cold looks, closed doors, a reputation crumbling in real time before her very eyes. She watches for it, tense with anticipation, expecting the room to slowly turn against you. Instead, the conversation simply continues, warm and entirely unbothered. You remain standing exactly where you were, fully intact. The link she took as absolutely iron between a lady's speech and a lady's worth has snapped clean in half before her eyes, suggesting to her that respect, in your world, is built on something else entirely, something that has nothing to do with the tidiness of a woman's tongue. She sits, salts forgotten entirely in her lap, watching a respectable woman curse cheerfully at furniture, at friends, at the general comedy of an ordinary day, and lose nothing whatsoever for it. To her, you have broadcast your own downfall a dozen times before lunch and somehow remain standing regardless. To you, it's just how you talk, and the words carry no real weight beyond the passing moment they occupy. The coarse language that would have banished her from every drawing room she ever knew has become, in your century, simply speech. She notices with some private surprise that she wasn't shocked the third time. By the fourth, she very nearly smiled. Now you've seen something genuinely funny and you laugh. Really laugh, head tipped back, mouth wide open, the sound of it carrying clean across the whole room, and the people nearest you simply smile back rather than recoil in embarrassment on your behalf. The lady in the corner is scandalized on your behalf before she can even fully process what she's watching. Restraint was everything in her world. A lady was trained from girlhood to laugh softly behind a raised fan whenever possible, never drawing loud, undignified attention to herself in a crowded room. Boisterous laughter suggested a lack of self-control, and self-control was, in essence, the entire performance of being a lady in the first place. Your open, room-filling laugh strikes her as magnificent and reckless in more or less equal measure, and some small, long-buried part of her, we rather suspect, wishes quietly that she could join in. Let her recall the choreography of the approved laugh, because it was, in its own way, a genuine skill she spent years perfecting. A lady's amusement was meant to be contained, a soft sound, a lowered gaze, a fan raised just in time to shield an open mouth from public view. The whole aim of the performance was to demonstrate that even her joy remained governed, that her feelings never spilled past the borders good breeding had drawn around her. Loud laughter broke every one of those careful borders at once. It was uncontained. It drew eyes. It filled a room a lady was trained to occupy as quietly as possible. To laugh the way you do would have marked her, instantly, as unschooled, unguarded, faintly out of control. Consider your posture as you laugh, too, because that alone would have troubled her deeply. Your head tips back. Your mouth opens fully, without restraint. There is no fan, no shielding hand raised protectively in front of your face. The whole undignified physical mechanics of real joy are on plain display for anyone to see. In her world, this abandon of the body was nearly as troubling as the noise itself. A woman visibly overtaken by feeling, momentarily forgetting to compose herself for the benefit of the room. You forget to compose yourself constantly, and on purpose, because the joke was simply good enough that composing yourself felt entirely beside the point. Now the volume, which travels somewhere a lady's amusement was never meant to reach in the first place. Your laugh crosses the entire room, announcing your delight openly to total strangers, filling a public space with the private fact of your happiness for anyone nearby to witness. In her world, a woman claimed as little space as possible, in voice just as much as in body, and a laugh loud enough to carry was, by definition, a laugh that had overstepped its proper bounds. You overstepped those bounds gladly, and repeatedly, without a trace of apology for the room your joy happens to take up. And here is the turn she genuinely does not expect. No one nearby is offended in the slightest. The people around you smile back. Some laugh right along with you, drawn toward your delight rather than repelled by its volume. The loud, open laugh that her world insisted would mark a woman as coarse instead makes you, in this room, warm and magnetic and thoroughly good company. The careful restraint she practiced her entire life, the fan and the lowered gaze and the meticulously governed joy produced, she begins to quietly suspect, a much quieter woman than she ever needed to become, but not perhaps a happier one. She sits beside you, salts entirely abandoned somewhere in her lap, watching a respectable woman laugh with her whole chest in public and be loved for it rather than diminished by it. To her, you are magnificently, recklessly unrestrained, a lady who forgot her fan entirely and gained the room instead. To you, something was simply funny, and you laughed the way people naturally do. When the next joke lands, she notices, with some private alarm, that her own mouth is twitching upward at the corners, the fan of old habit half raised out of pure reflex. And then, for the first time all evening, she lets it drop back into her lap entirely. Let's step outside together now, or rather, let's watch you step outside completely on your own. No older married woman trailing a few paces behind you for propriety's sake. No maid sent along to keep watch. No male relative appointed to guard your reputation for the afternoon. You simply open the door and leave. For an unmarried lady in 1811, this was very nearly unthinkable. Her honor functioned as a kind of fragile currency in her world, and being seen unaccompanied in public could invite gossip capable of ruining her marriage prospects permanently, sometimes over nothing more than an unlucky glance from the wrong window. A chaperone was never an insult to a woman of her standing. It was armor, plain and simple, worn every time she left the house. Let her explain what the chaperone truly represented, because in her mind it was never merely a nuisance to be tolerated. It was protection, in a world where a woman's entire worth hinged on a spotless reputation, and reputation could be stained by nothing more than mere appearance, true or otherwise. An unmarried woman seen walking alone, or seen in the company of a man without a witness present, could have stories invented about her that no later truth would ever fully scrub away. The chaperone stood as a living guarantee that nothing improper had taken place, a witness whose very presence vouched for a woman's continued respectability. To go without one wasn't freedom in her world at all. It was leaving the house with no shield whatsoever. Consider, too, who the chaperone ultimately answered to, because that's the part she still assumes must apply to you somehow. A young woman's movements were in effect licensed by her household, approved in advance, supervised throughout. Her honor treated as a family asset far too valuable to leave untended for even an afternoon. You step out your own door having asked permission of no one, informed no one of your plans, sought no approval whatsoever, and arranged no escort of any kind. There is no married aunt adjusting her bonnet to hurry along behind you. No maid rushing to keep pace at a respectful distance. The entire apparatus of supervision that once governed every single outing a woman made simply doesn't exist in your world at all. You close the door behind you, and the whole day becomes entirely, uncomplicatedly yours. Now watch where this newfound freedom actually takes you, because it's the sheer ordinariness of it that stuns her most. You don't do anything remotely scandalous with your unsupervised afternoon. You run a few errands. You meet a friend for lunch. You sit in that coffee house we mentioned earlier. You walk a long way home simply because the weather happens to be fine and you feel like it. The absence of a chaperone doesn't produce ruin of any kind. It produces, instead, a perfectly ordinary life, lived entirely at your own direction and on your own schedule. In her world, the absence of that shield implied disaster was surely close behind. In yours, its absence simply means you got to decide how to spend your own afternoon, and nothing whatsoever came of the deciding. And the reputation she'd expect to see crumbling under the weight of all this unsupervised freedom stays perfectly, stubbornly intact. No unkind stories trail you home at the end of the day. No promising marriage prospect is quietly withdrawn because someone happened to see you alone near the shops around noon. The entire gossip machine she feared her whole life, the one capable of ruining a woman on appearances alone, either doesn't exist in any meaningful way in your world, or has simply lost all its old power over people like you. Your honor, it turns out, was never a fragile object that others held in trust and could shatter with an idle rumor. It belongs to you, steady and unbothered by whether anyone happened to be watching you walk down the street that day. That particular idea, that a woman's standing might not depend at all on being witnessed by the right people, takes her a genuinely long moment to hold and turn over in her mind. So she trails a few steps behind you through the street out of pure old habit, the phantom chaperone she never actually asked for, salt still in hand, watching a respectable woman move through an entire city alone and come to absolutely no harm at all. To her, you walk unshielded through a world that ought, by her own rules, to be brimming with danger to your name. To you, you're just out, running your own errands, answerable to yourself and to no one else. The armor she never once left home without has become, in your century, largely unnecessary because the thing it was built to guard against has, for the most part, quietly disappeared. Eventually she stops trailing you. She realizes, somewhat to her own surprise, that she doesn't actually have to, and she finds that the not having to feels, unexpectedly, very much like the point of the whole exercise. Here's one that requires several careful explanations before she can even manage to be properly horrified. You pick up your glowing rectangle of a device and send words directly to a man first, without waiting politely for him to write to you initially, at an hour when all decent, respectable people ought to be soundly asleep, about a matter of no real importance whatsoever. In the Regency world, correspondence between an unmarried lady and a gentleman was governed by very strict and specific rules, and a lady writing to him first, casually, and after dark, would have signaled something rather scandalous about her true intentions. That you do exactly this while lying comfortably in bed, eating a small snack, purely because the thought crossed your mind and you felt like sharing it, quietly redraws her entire map of what a woman is even permitted to want, let alone act upon. Let her first understand the sheer miracle of the message itself, before she can even begin to reach the scandal buried inside it. In her world, a letter took days to arrive, was composed with real care, sealed carefully with wax, entrusted to the postal service, and awaited with real patience across what could be very long silences indeed. Your words leave your fingertips and land in his hand in the space of a single breath. No wax seal. No waiting for the post. She genuinely struggles even to picture correspondence moving quite so instantly that it barely seems to deserve the name letter at all. Then she remembers precisely what you've actually done with this small miracle, and the wonder curdles quickly back into alarm, because you used it to write to a man first, plainly, without any hesitation whatsoever. Consider the rules you've broken here, because in her world they arrived in a very strict and thoroughly knowable order. A lady did not open a correspondence with a gentleman on her own initiative. She waited. He wrote first if the situation was proper. Through the appropriate channels and with clear intention stated or at least strongly implied. She replied only within careful bounds afterward. Whoever spoke first, in this careful little dance, declared their interest openly, and for a woman to be the one to declare first was to hand over a weapon that could very easily be turned against her own reputation later. You wrote first plainly, with no channel whatsoever and no chaperoning hand anywhere near the process, announcing your interest as easily as you might remark on the weather outside. The careful, choreographed game of who speaks first, which shaped her entire understanding of proper courtship, you have simply declined to play at all. Now consider the hour, too, which compounds the offense considerably in her eyes. Not the respectable daylight hours during which proper correspondence was traditionally composed, but the deep middle of the night, when in her world only trouble of one kind or another was typically still awake. A message sent after dark carried within it a certain heat, a certain intimacy, a suggestion of secrets that no polite daytime letter would ever have implied. You send yours at midnight from bed, surrounded by snacks, with roughly the emotional weight of a passing shrug. The scandalous hour that would have all but screamed improper intentions to her is, to you, simply whenever you happen to think of something mildly amusing worth sharing with someone. The heat she instinctively reads into the timing simply isn't there in reality. There's only a snack and a passing thought, and the almost total nothingness of the content defeats her final line of defense entirely. She could perhaps have braced herself for a bold woman writing to a man first if the matter at hand were genuinely grave, a warning, an urgent piece of news, some serious word that couldn't wait. But you write about nothing much at all. A joke, an idle question, a small observation you didn't think was worth saving for the morning. In her world, correspondence was too costly and too fraught with meaning to be spent casually on trifles of this kind. You spend it on trifles constantly, back and forth, an endless casual river of small nothings flowing freely between women and men who owe each other no formal obligation whatsoever. The whole weighty architecture of formal courtship letters has, in your century, simply dissolved into easy, meaningless, genuinely delightful chatter. So she perches carefully on the edge of your bed, salts in one hand, watching a perfectly respectable woman message a man first, at midnight, about absolutely nothing, purely for the small private pleasure of it. To her, you have broken nearly every rule of proper correspondence at once and suffered no consequence beyond a friendly reply sent back within minutes. To you, you simply had a passing thought and sent it along the way you send 100 others most weeks. The strict order of who may write to whom, and when, and for what reason has become in your century no order at all, and in the sheer freedom of that she glimpses something she was never once allowed to reach for herself. A want, expressed simply because it happened to be hers to express. Let's talk now about your romantic life more broadly, because she finds it both thrilling and genuinely alarming in roughly equal measure. You meet men. You spend time with them, getting to know each one a little better. You decide, in your own time and by your own judgment, whether you actually like them, and if you don't, you simply move on to someone else entirely, all without a single formal engagement being announced or a single family negotiation taking place behind closed doors. In the Regency era, courtship was a serious, closely supervised, and often quite financially motivated affair, aimed squarely and unambiguously at eventual marriage. A lady did not sample suitors the way one might sample dishes at a dinner party, purely for her own enjoyment. That you treat the whole business as something to explore at your own comfortable pace, guided entirely by your own judgment, and with no dowry discussions taking place anywhere in the background, makes her genuinely wonder who exactly is meant to be managing your future on your behalf. The answer, of course, is that you are. Let her recall what courtship actually weighed in her own world, because it was never a light matter, not even slightly. It was, in effect, the negotiation of a woman's entire future, her financial security, her social standing, very often the combined fortunes of her whole extended family, all riding together on a single match made young and made with great care. Suitors were assessed far less for how they made a woman's heart feel, and far more for what they brought to the union in land, income, and useful family connections. The whole process was watched closely, guided firmly, and hurried steadily toward its one proper and expected conclusion, a marriage. You have taken this grave, consequential machinery and turned it, in your own life, into something that more closely resembles a pastime, and she genuinely cannot locate where all the old seriousness went. Consider the plurality of it, too, which alarms her most directly of all. Not one single suitor, courted with clear and stated intentions toward eventual marriage, but several, met one after another, or sometimes very nearly at once, each one given a fair and honest hearing before you make up your mind. In her world, entertaining the attentions of more than one man simultaneously was a very fast route to a thoroughly ruined name, the unmistakable mark of a woman not to be trusted by respectable families. You do this openly and cheerfully, treating each meeting as simply more information, a way of learning what you actually like and don't like in a partner before committing to anyone at all. The strict exclusivity that once guarded a lady's reputation so carefully has given way, in your world, to a frank and unhurried sampling process that would have scandalized every matron of her acquaintance without exception. Now watch how easily you release the ones who simply don't suit you, because the sheer ease of it startles her considerably. In her world, extracting oneself from a serious courtship already underway was delicate at best, and very often nearly impossible, tangled up thoroughly in expectation, family involvement, and the constant fear of what people might say about the broken match afterward. You simply decide, quite plainly, that a particular man isn't right for you. Tell him so directly, and both of you move on with your respective lives, largely undamaged by the whole experience. No dowry has been discussed and now needs to be carefully unpicked. No families have shaken hands prematurely on an arrangement now falling through. No future has been publicly staked and now needs to be publicly walked back. The low stakes involved, which she can scarcely even imagine, are precisely what let you choose honestly in the first place, keeping only what you genuinely want and letting the rest go without lasting cost. And the complete absence of any overseeing manager is the detail that truly reorders her thinking here. She keeps looking for the hand quietly guiding all of this from somewhere behind the scenes, the father carefully weighing incomes, the mother steering you gently toward the most advantageous match, the extended family council with its own real stake in the eventual outcome. There isn't one anywhere to be found. You are the father, the mother, and the entire council, all rolled into one. You weigh the suitors yourself. You judge the fit yourself. You decide the pace of things and the eventual ending, whatever it turns out to be. And your standard for judging isn't what a particular match might bring to your family's fortunes, but simply whether this specific person is genuinely right for you as an individual. The whole apparatus that once decided a woman's future on her behalf has been quietly replaced, in your world, by the woman herself making the decision. She watches you move through your own romantic life, salts in hand, meeting men on your own clear terms, keeping the ones you like and releasing the rest without any lasting ruin attached to either choice. To her, you are gambling recklessly with a matter her world insisted should be gravely and carefully managed by others on your behalf. To you, you're simply getting to know people patiently, until one of them proves worth keeping for the long term. And underneath all her visible alarm, she feels something else stirring too, quietly. The thrill of the idea that a woman's own heart might genuinely be hers alone to spend as she sees fit. Now brace her gently for this next one. You share your home with a man you love. You cook together most evenings. You sleep together, share a bed and a set of household bills, and you are not married to him, and may not be for years yet, if indeed you ever marry him at all. To the lady watching, an arrangement like this had a very specific name in her world, and it was not a polite one. Living openly with a man outside the bounds of marriage would have destroyed a lady standing entirely and permanently, cutting her off from respectable society for good, with no path back. That your neighbors know about the arrangement, that your own family knows, and that everyone around you simply accepts it as a perfectly normal stage of adult life, leaves her genuinely speechless for a long moment, which, for a woman as composed as she is, counts as a considerable achievement all on its own. Let her sit properly with the enormity of what she's witnessing here. because in her world this ranked among the very worst falls a woman could possibly take. Marriage was the line that separated the respectable from the ruined, cleanly and without exception, and to live with a man on the wrong side of that line was to place yourself permanently beyond any hope of social rescue. It wasn't merely a private matter between two consenting adults. It was, in her world, a full-blown public catastrophe, the kind that ended invitations, severed family ties for good, and followed a woman around afterward as a permanent shadow she could never quite outrun. She braces herself for the fallout that must surely follow your own arrangement, the scandalized whispers, the quietly closing doors, the slow social exile. She waits for it. The doors, as far as she can tell, all stay open. The neighbors, when they pass by, simply wave. Consider the sheer openness of it all, too, because that's what she truly cannot reconcile with anything she knows. If an arrangement like this existed at all in her world, it existed hidden, denied outright if ever directly questioned, wrapped tightly in layers of protective shame. You hide nothing whatsoever. Your own family visits regularly and shares meals with the two of you together at your own table. Your neighbors know exactly who lives in your home with you and think absolutely nothing of it either way. You refer to the man casually, in public, as your partner, and not a single person around you so much as flinches at the word. The secrecy that would have represented pure survival in her world is simply, entirely absent from yours, because there is nothing left here to keep secret in the first place, since the underlying thing itself is no longer treated as any kind of disgrace at all. Now watch the ordinary, everyday domesticity of the whole arrangement, because that strips away the very last of her remaining expectations. You cook together most evenings, arguing gently and good-naturedly over the recipe. You split the household costs evenly, like true partners in a small, warm, shared enterprise. You share a bed, a life, and a set of keys, building together something that looks, in every practical sense, remarkably like a marriage, minus only the formal ceremony and the accompanying paperwork. In her world, this particular shape of shared life belonged strictly inside the bounds of wedlock, and to have it without the accompanying vows was to possess only a kind of counterfeit respectability, hollow at its core. In yours, it is a genuine and openly honored stage of adult life, chosen freely by both of you, with no fraud or pretense involved in it anywhere at all. And the real possibility that you may never marry at all is the part that ultimately leaves her the most thoroughly wordless. You might marry him one day. You might not, and remain perfectly, contentedly happy regardless, building decades of a genuinely shared life together without ever once signing an official register. In her world, marriage represented the one necessary destination, the only proper and acceptable end to any serious bond between a man and a woman, the single event that legitimized everything else that came before or after it. You have detached the shared life itself entirely from the ceremony, keeping the partnership fully intact while treating the wedding as something optional, an event you might eventually hold if the mood strikes you, or might simply never bother with at all. The destination she long assumed was mandatory has become, for you, one option among several equally valid ones, and none of them, as far as she can see, carries any disgrace attached to it whatsoever. So she stands quietly in your shared kitchen, salts entirely forgotten somewhere on the counter, watching a thoroughly respectable woman build an openly unmarried life alongside a man she genuinely loves, while her own family sets the table nearby and her neighbors think absolutely nothing of the arrangement at all. To her, you are living out the one arrangement that ought, by every rule she was raised on, to have ended you socially, and instead you seem thoroughly, ordinarily, quietly happy with your choice. To you, it's simply your home, your person, and your shared life together. The rigid line between respectable and ruin that she never once dared even approach in her own life has, in your century, quietly and almost completely dissolved. And in watching it dissolve before her, she glimpses a whole life she'd have been forbidden even to privately want, laid out plainly in front of her over a shared Tuesday dinner. Let's suppose for a moment that you do choose to marry one day. If you do, you'll almost certainly marry for love, choosing someone entirely by your own judgment, with very little regard given to his income, his land holdings, or whether the match happens to improve your family's overall fortunes in any measurable way. Or, just as easily, you may simply choose never to marry at all, and remain perfectly content with that decision for the rest of your life. In the Regency world, marriage was very often the single most important economic decision a woman would ever make in her entire life, and remaining unmarried usually meant a lifetime of dependence on relatives, along with the quiet, permanent label of spinster attached to your name. That you view marriage itself as fully optional, and love as the deciding factor rather than acreage or income, strikes the lady watching as either wildly romantic or dangerously impractical, depending entirely on the hour of the day you ask her. Let her recall what marriage actually decided, once and for all, in her own world, because it decided nearly everything a woman would ever have. It set her income for life, her home, her social standing, her security in old age, all determined in a single choice made once and rarely, if ever, undone afterward. Because so very much rode on that one choice, love was frequently a luxury the match itself could scarcely afford to prioritize. A sensible family weighed a suitor's land and fortune, his connections and future prospects, carefully and at length, while a woman's own private feelings came somewhere well down the resulting list, if they made the list at all. To marry purely for feeling, ignoring all that hard practical calculation entirely, would have seemed to her rather like staking one's entire life on a passing whim. Consider your own standard now, because it reverses her old priorities almost completely. You look first, and mostly, at whether you genuinely love the person in question, whether he treats you kindly, whether a shared life with him would actually be a good one day to day. His income, you can very often supply for yourself already. His land holdings are largely beside the point. Whether the match happens to lift your family's fortunes doesn't enter your thinking at all, because your own fortunes are entirely your own to build and manage. The very factors that once topped her list without question, security and social advantage, you have already set aside as things you can provide for yourself, freeing you up entirely to choose on the one basis her world could rarely, if ever, allow. Love placed firmly at the very top of the list, because nothing more urgent is competing for that particular spot in your considerations. Now, the other path available to you, the one that unsettles her most of all. You might not marry at all ever, and if you don't, you will not become a pitied dependent tucked away in some relative's spare room, a spinster quietly whispered about behind closed doors and grudgingly supported out of family duty alone. You will have your own income, your own home, your own genuinely full life, with or without a marriage attached to it. In her world, the unmarried woman was widely regarded as something close to a burden, a cautionary tale told to younger girls, her very singleness treated as a kind of quiet failure to be softened, at best, through acts of family charity. In yours, remaining single is simply one complete and respectable way to live a life, every bit as whole as any other. The old word spinster has lost nearly all of its sting here, because the fate it once described has, in your world, largely lost its teeth as well. And the sheer optionality of the whole thing is what she keeps circling back to, unable to file it neatly away anywhere in her own understanding. In her world, marriage was never really a genuine choice so much as it was a necessity carefully dressed up to look like one, the single thing a woman absolutely had to secure for herself, or else suffer visibly for lacking it. You treat marriage as genuinely optional, a door you may walk through eventually if the right person happens to be standing on the other side of it, and a door you may just as easily leave closed indefinitely, with no penalty attached to that choice either. That a woman's entire future need not hinge on successfully catching a husband, that she might build real security and real standing entirely on her own, and marry only for love, or else not marry at all, is an arrangement so thoroughly free of the old familiar pressures that she has to keep quietly reminding herself, again and again, that it's actually real. So she considers you now, salt still in hand, a woman who will either marry someday purely for love, or else remain contentedly unmarried, secure and fully respected either way the decision eventually falls. To her, you are either the luckiest romantic she has ever personally encountered, or else a gambler who has decided to ignore every sensible rule her own world lived and died by. To you, marriage is simply one possible shape a genuinely good life might eventually take, chosen freely for the heart involved, or set aside entirely without a trace of shame either way. The single most consequential decision of her entire world has become, in yours, essentially a matter of personal preference, and whether she finds the whole idea romantic or reckless seems to depend rather heavily, she notices, on exactly how brave she happens to be feeling in that particular hour. Here's a concept she keeps circling back to as well, unable to properly file it anywhere in her existing understanding of the world. You have men in your life who are simply your friends, nothing more, nothing less. You meet them for meals from time to time. You text them your problems when you have them, and they text you theirs in return. You hug them hello and goodbye without a second thought, and there is no romance involved anywhere in any of it, no scandal attached, and absolutely no expectation of eventual marriage hanging over any of these friendships whatsoever. In the Regency era, the available space between formal courtship and actual family relation was very narrow indeed, and a close, casual friendship between an unmarried lady and an unrelated gentleman would have raised more than a few eyebrows and invited plenty of unwelcome assumptions almost immediately. That you can genuinely, comfortably be friends with a man, with nothing at all owed between you and nothing implied by the friendship itself, quietly reorders something rather fundamental in how she understands the entire relationship between men and women generally. Let her map out the limited categories her own world offered her, because they left no real room whatsoever for what you clearly have with these men. In her world, an unrelated gentleman was almost always understood to be one of only a few possible things: a suitor, a potential future suitor, or else a danger to be carefully chaperoned against at all times. He was very rarely, if ever, simply a friend and nothing more. Every prolonged closeness between a woman and a man carried within it an implied trajectory of some kind, moving steadily either toward courtship, toward eventual marriage, or toward outright scandal if the whole thing led nowhere proper in the end. There was, in short, no truly neutral ground available anywhere, no space where a woman and an unrelated man might simply enjoy one another's company with no particular destination in mind at all. You live comfortably on exactly that neutral ground, as though it had always existed there, waiting for you. Consider the sheer ease of your dealings with these men, too, because it genuinely unsettles her existing assumptions. You meet them for a meal, sometimes just the two of you alone together, and nothing whatsoever is presumed by anyone as a result. You share your genuine troubles with them and listen closely to theirs in return, a real and honest exchange of confidence with no romantic undertone lurking anywhere beneath it. You greet them with a warm, easy embrace, and part from them the very same way, and not one single observer reads any hidden courtship into the physical contact involved. In her world, each of these small, ordinary acts, the private shared meal, the exchanged confidence, the simple touch, would have represented a clear step along a path leading toward only one respectable eventual destination. You perform all of them purely as friendship, complete and entirely sufficient on its own terms, going nowhere in particular and needing to go nowhere at all. Now, the total absence of assumption surrounding all of it is what she keeps failing to properly file away in her own mind. When you spend a perfectly pleasant afternoon with a male friend, absolutely no one asks when the happy engagement announcement might be coming. No worried aunt frets quietly in the background. No rumor stirs anywhere among the neighbors. No one concludes, automatically, that this much visible closeness must inevitably mean courtship is underway somewhere beneath the surface. In her world, the eyebrow rose almost entirely on reflex, because the available categories genuinely allowed for nothing else. In yours, the very possibility of pure, uncomplicated friendship between a man and a woman is simply understood and taken for granted, so thoroughly ordinary that it needs no defending or explaining to anyone at all. And the nothing-owed quality of it all is perhaps the real freedom that reorders her deepest assumptions most completely. These particular friendships carry no hidden debt within them, no implied future promise, no lingering expectation that all this genuine warmth must eventually be paid off somehow, either through eventual marriage or else through some scandalous ending. You give and receive real affection freely between you, and the account, so to speak, simply balances itself out as friendship, needing no further settlement of any kind down the road. In her world, a man's attentions toward a woman always implied he was owed something in return, or at least hoped to be eventually, and a woman's own warmth functioned as a kind of currency, spent carefully and strategically toward an eventual match. You have unlinked warmth entirely from any sense of obligation. You can genuinely care for a man, and he for you in return, and that simply can be the entire whole of it, nothing more required. So she watches you laugh comfortably over lunch with a man who is genuinely, purely only ever your friend, salts idle and forgotten in her lap, trying quietly to place a bond her own world never gave her any proper name for at all. To her, this particular closeness should logically be leading somewhere, should mean something more, should be risking something significant. To you, it's simply friendship, one of the many plain good things that fill up a genuinely full life. The narrow space that once hemmed her tightly in between formal courtship and formal family relation has widened considerably, in your century, into genuinely open ground, where a woman and a man may simply be fond of one another without any further complication attached. And standing on that particular open ground, watching you, she begins to see that a woman today simply gets to have far more people in her life to love, in far more different ways, than her own world ever permitted her. Let's follow you now into the evening, because you're going out at night entirely by yourself, and you'll return home again whenever you personally feel like it. No escort accompanying you, no strict curfew hanging over your head, no anxious relative sitting up late by candlelight, waiting to guard your good name until you're safely back indoors. For an unmarried lady in 1811, the hours after dark carried very real danger, both to her physical safety and to her reputation simultaneously, and being seen out alone at night was generally reserved, in the public imagination, for women's society had already quietly written off entirely. That you move freely through the lamplit streets, keys in hand, deciding entirely on your own exactly when to return home, appears to the lady watching as an almost unimaginable kind of ownership over your own evening hours. Let her recall what nightfall genuinely meant for a woman in her own world, because it drew a hard, unmistakable line straight across every single day. Once real darkness fell, the streets belonged, by common understanding, to danger and to men, and a respectable woman withdrew indoors for the evening, her outings for the day firmly concluded, her remaining hours handed over entirely to the quiet routines of the household. To be abroad after dark, alone, was to court both real physical harm and total social ruin at the very same time, because a woman seen out alone at night was automatically assumed to be exactly the kind of woman who had nothing left of value remaining to protect. The lamplit evening hours you move through so freely and so casually were, in her world, hours a respectable lady simply surrendered entirely without question. Consider the streets themselves, too, dim and genuinely threatening in her own memory, thick with unknown danger for any woman moving through them without a proper escort at her side. A woman alone in those streets after dark was terribly exposed to potential violence, to false accusation, to invented stories that would easily outlive whatever the actual truth of the matter happened to be. The escort wasn't merely a social formality in her world. It was, quite literally, the entire difference between safety and real peril for a woman alone. You walk those exact same evening streets today with no escort whatsoever, keys held loosely in one hand, phone tucked into your pocket, entirely unhurried and entirely unafraid the whole way home. The peril she took as an absolute certainty, the very reason a respectable woman never once went out alone after dark, has thinned considerably in your world into something closer to background caution, rather than an outright cage confining your movements. Now the complete absence of any curfew, which she keeps quietly expecting to reassert itself at any moment. In her world, even a simple daytime outing answered ultimately to the household's clock, and the evening hours most strictly of all. A woman's hours, in a very real sense, were never entirely her own to command. You have no hour by which you must be home tonight, no worried relative sitting up specifically to receive you at the door, no account whatsoever that you're expected to give afterward about exactly where your evening went. You'll return home whenever you're genuinely ready to, at whatever hour happens to suit you best, letting yourself back in with your own key to a home that asks absolutely nothing of you upon your return. The old clock that once governed her every comings and goings has, for you, simply and permanently stopped ticking altogether. You keep your own time now entirely, and the full ownership of the evening hours is what strikes her most deeply of everything she's witnessed tonight. In her world, the hours after dark were something a woman was expected to give up entirely, ceded willingly to men and to danger, and to the fixed rules of her own household. You possess those same hours outright, free and clear. The night itself is yours to spend exactly as you like, on friends, on quiet wandering, on whatever genuinely pleases you in the moment, and it ends only when you personally decide it should end, not a moment before. That a woman might own her own evenings so completely, might treat the dark hours as open territory to explore rather than as a constant threat to be feared and avoided, represents a kind of freedom she was simply never once offered in her own lifetime. It isn't only that you're safe out there alone tonight. It's that the time itself genuinely, fully belongs to you now, start to finish. So she stands quietly at your door as you head out into the soft lamplit dark, salts entirely forgotten somewhere behind her, watching a thoroughly respectable woman claim the whole night for herself as casually as she might once have claimed a quiet afternoon. To her, you are walking, unescorted, directly into hours a lady was carefully taught to fear and to surrender without question. To you, you're simply heading out for the evening, and you'll be back home again whenever you're back. The evening hours she was made to hand over dutifully, every single day of her life, have become, in your century, entirely yours to keep, safe enough now to walk through freely, and free enough now to spend exactly as you please. And as you disappear down the softly lit street, keys jingling faintly in your hand, she understands, quite suddenly, that she doesn't actually need to wait up for you tonight. No one does anymore. The night, it turns out, is simply yours now, fully and completely. Now here is the one that finally makes her sit down properly, all the way down, as though her knees genuinely can't hold the weight of it any longer. You have work. Real, paid employment, complete with a proper title, a clear sense of purpose, and genuine future prospects that belong entirely to you and to no one else. In the Regency world, a gentlewoman who found herself in real need of independent income had almost no respectable options available to her at all, the most common by far being that of governess, a lonely and very often thankless position sitting permanently at the uneasy edge of someone else's household. Ambition, in anything resembling the professional sense of the word, simply was not offered to a woman of her class or standing, under any circumstances whatsoever. That you hold a genuine career you chose for yourself, and speak openly of climbing steadily higher within it over time, tells the lady watching that the entire ceiling that once sat permanently above every woman's head has been quietly lifted away altogether, and she genuinely isn't certain whether the correct response is to weep over what she missed, or to applaud what you now simply take for granted. Let her recall the narrow, limited shelf of options her own world offered any gentlewoman genuinely in need of money of her own. There was the position of governess, teaching another family's children patiently, while belonging fully to neither the family proper nor to the household's regular servants, respected by essentially no one, and genuinely lonely in that uncomfortable gap between the two. There was the paid companion, a rather genteel form of servitude spent attending some wealthy elderly woman day after day. And beyond those two narrow paths, there was very little else at all that a lady of standing might respectably do without permanently losing her rank in society as a direct result. Work, for a woman of her particular class, was mostly understood as a quiet admission of real misfortune having befallen the family. You call your own work a career. You say the word with genuine pride, and you treat it openly as a source of real standing rather than as any kind of social loss. Consider, too, that your work carries an actual title attached to it, a name that means something specific and recognized out in the wider world, a role you casually introduce yourself by whenever you meet someone new. In her world, a woman's entire identity flowed almost exclusively from her family and eventually from her marriage, whose daughter she happened to be, whose eventual wife she would become. You possess an identity that is simply, fully yours, earned through your own effort, professional in nature, and entirely unattached to any man in your life whatsoever. When strangers ask what you do for a living, you answer them plainly with the work itself, not with any mention of your household, and that simple answer alone places you clearly somewhere in the wider world, entirely on your own individual account. The idea that a woman might be known first and foremost for what she actually does, rather than for whom she happens to belong to, is an entirely new concept to her. Now the ambition itself, which is truly the part that finally makes her sit all the way down. You don't merely hold your current position and stay quietly content there indefinitely. You genuinely intend to rise within it over time, to move toward greater responsibility, greater skill, and greater standing, all built entirely on the strength of your own sustained effort. In her world, ambition of this professional kind was understood as something close to an engine belonging exclusively to men, the very force that drove sons steadily toward fortune while daughters, by contrast, were carefully steered instead toward securing a good marriage. A woman possessing genuine professional ambition in her world had essentially nowhere at all to point that ambition. You point yours confidently and openly upward, and the ceiling that once stopped every woman of her acquaintance simply isn't there above you at all. You describe, quite plainly, exactly where you mean to go next, as though the going itself were obviously, unquestionably allowed, because in your world it plainly simply is. And the fact that you chose this particular work yourself reorders her entire sense of what a woman's working life can even mean. You weren't placed into this career by simple misfortune, nor arranged into it through some family connection or negotiation. You looked, quite deliberately, across the wide field of possible work available to you, and you selected the specific thing that genuinely suited your own mind and your own particular interests best. In her world, real choice was scarcely ever part of a woman's relationship to labor in the first place, since labor itself was, for women of her class, mostly something to be avoided entirely if at all possible. You made a positive, deliberate choice toward a genuine calling, pursued it steadily over time, and built an entire meaningful life around it that stands complete and worthwhile on its own terms. The work isn't some fallback position adopted after a failed marriage attempt. It's a life you actively wanted for yourself, and one you went out and got through your own sustained effort. So she sits, salts held loosely in one hand, watching a thoroughly respectable woman speak openly of her career and her future ambitions with exactly the same easy confidence her own world, reserved strictly for men alone. To her, the ceiling that once capped every woman's realistic prospects has been lifted so entirely high that she genuinely cannot locate it anywhere above you. To you, it's simply your job, and you happen to have real plans for where it's headed next. The narrow shelf of governess and paid companion that once defined her entire world has widened, in your century, into a whole open field of possibility that a woman may freely choose from, and steadily climb through over the course of an entire working lifetime. And watching you speak so plainly of your own ambitions, she genuinely cannot decide whether to weep quietly for everything she personally was never once offered, or to simply applaud what you so easily take for granted every single day. In the end, watching you a little longer, she finds herself doing a fair measure of both at once. Let's follow that money of yours a little further, because this next part astonishes her even more than the career itself did. The wages you earn belong entirely to you. You decide entirely on your own how they're spent, saved, or given away to others, and no husband, no father, and no brother holds any legal claim over a single coin of it. In the Regency era, a married woman's property and income generally passed directly into her husband's legal control the very moment she wed, a harsh legal reality that left a great many women financially powerless despite whatever wealth or standing they may have been born into originally. That you hold your own earnings in your own private account, spending them entirely as you personally wish, represents to the lady watching a form of independence she was simply never once permitted, in her own lifetime, to even properly imagine for herself. Let her sit for a moment with the legal reality that shaped her entire world, because it was considerably harsher than mere social custom alone. Upon marriage, a woman's money, and very often much of her property besides, generally ceased to be genuinely hers in any practical sense at all, folding directly into her husband's legal control to manage however he personally saw fit. What she brought into the marriage as her own, what she might later inherit from her own family, even in many cases what she herself managed to earn through her own labor, could all pass directly into his hands regardless of her own wishes in the matter. A wife could, in principle, be born to real wealth, and still hold no genuine power over even a single coin of it once married. Her entire financial security depended in the end almost completely on her husband's personal character alone. You hold your own money outright, and no husband's character, good or bad, enters into that equation at all. Consider the account that belongs to you alone, a thing she can genuinely barely picture existing at all. Your wages arrive directly into a store of money that carries your own name and answers to absolutely no one else but you. No father needs to approve of your spending decisions. No brother oversees your personal savings on your behalf. No husband decides on your behalf what you may and may not purchase with your own earnings. In her world, a woman's entire financial life was always mediated through some man or another, her access to her own resources filtered carefully through his personal permission at every turn. You have no such filter standing between you and your own money. It goes wherever you choose to send it, and the only judgment involved anywhere in the process is entirely your own. Now watch what you actually do with your money, because the freedom involved is both total and entirely casual, almost unremarkable to you. You spend on whatever genuinely pleases you, small everyday pleasures alongside larger significant decisions alike, without ever needing to seek anyone else's leave beforehand. You save carefully toward your own personal goals, chosen entirely by you, for a future you are actively shaping yourself on your own terms. You give money away, when you choose to causes and people you personally judge to be worthy of it, an act of independent generosity that her own world would have required to be rooted through a husband's prior approval. Each of these small, ordinary choices represents a form of power that her own world withheld entirely from married women. You wield that same power a dozen times a day without even particularly noticing its true weight. And the underlying security beneath all of it is what moves her most deeply of everything. In her world, a woman's financial safety was always essentially borrowed, entirely dependent on the ongoing goodwill of whichever man controlled her means, and it could vanish overnight if he proved unwise, careless, or simply unkind. Your own security is entirely your own, generated through your own steady work, held securely in your own name, and it cannot be casually taken away by any husband's passing whim, nor squandered away through anyone else's foolishness but your own. You don't depend on any man's competence to remain safe in the world. You are, in the most concrete and literal sense possible, the sole guardian of your own future. The powerlessness she simply took as the basic condition of being a wife has, in your century, been replaced entirely by a woman standing firmly on her own ground. So she watches you handle your own money exactly as you see fit, salts entirely forgotten in her lap, a woman whose earnings answer to absolutely no man at all. To her, you hold an independence so complete and so total that she was never once permitted even to properly imagine it for herself. To you, it's simply your account, your wages, your own call to make. The old legal reality that once made wives financially powerless has fallen away entirely in your world, and standing in its place is a woman who earns, keeps, and commands her own means fully and completely. And of all the many scandals of your ordinary day, this may well be the one she'd trade almost anything to have genuinely had for herself, to hold her own coin, and to answer to no one at all for it. She never once got to know that particular feeling herself. Now show her the deed to your home, because you own real property outright, entirely in your own name, with no man's signature required anywhere on the paperwork. In her world, this was extraordinarily rare, and legally quite fraught even when it did occur, especially for a married woman, whose personal belongings very often ceased to be legally her own the moment she wed a single, unmarried woman fared somewhat better under the law. But property and inheritance were still shaped overwhelmingly, by both law and custom, to flow steadily toward sons and toward husbands rather than toward daughters. That you, a woman entirely on your own, simply bought a home, hold your own keys to it, and answer to absolutely no one about any of it, strikes the lady watching as precisely the sort of security she spent her entire life being told a woman could only ever obtain through marriage to a man. Let her hold the deed itself for a moment, and truly understand what it represents, because in her world a document like this, bearing a woman's own name alone, was almost a genuine marvel to behold. Property functioned as the very bedrock of real security and social standing in her world, and it was arranged, by both law and long custom, to flow overwhelmingly toward sons and husbands rather than toward the women in a family. A married woman's own belongings very often ceased to be legally hers at all. A single woman fared somewhat better under the law, but the whole surrounding machinery of inheritance and property ownership still leaned heavily away from her at nearly every turn. For a woman to hold an entire home outright in her own name, needing no man's consent anywhere in the process, was rare enough in her world to raise both eyebrows and pointed questions. You hold exactly such a deed today, and it raises absolutely nothing at all among the people around you. Consider how you actually came by this home, too, because the sheer plainness of it genuinely stuns her. You didn't inherit it through some unusual family arrangement, nor receive it as a gift from a husband, nor hold it in trust through some obliging male relative acting on your behalf. You earned the money yourself, decided quite plainly that you wanted a home of your own, and simply bought one outright. The entire transaction was conducted by you personally, signed by you personally, and completed entirely in your own name from start to finish. In her world, a woman acquiring property entirely on her own account, through her own means, with no man anywhere present in the chain of ownership, was scarcely conceivable as a real possibility. You did it as an entirely ordinary adult decision, rather the way one might once have purchased a fine bonnet in her world, only considerably larger in scale, and entirely, fully yours from the very start. Now the keys themselves, which she keeps returning to again and again as proof of everything she's witnessing, they are genuinely yours. The home they unlock belongs to you. You may paint its walls however you please, change its locks whenever you like, invite whomever you choose inside, and turn away whomever you choose to turn away, all entirely on your own personal authority. No husband holds any superior claim over the property. No father needs to approve of your choices within its walls. No brother oversees its keeping on your behalf. In her world, A woman's relationship to any home she lived in was almost always defined by her status as someone else's dependent, a daughter living beneath her father's roof, later a wife living beneath her husband's roof in turn. You live beneath your own roof entirely, and that roof itself is registered fully in your own name. The distinction between these two situations is genuinely everything, and the security it provides you is precisely the thing her world insisted, quite firmly, that a woman could only ever obtain by marrying well. In her day, a woman's one truly safe place in the entire world came exclusively through a husband. Her home, her social standing, her eventual shelter in old age, all borrowed entirely from him and dependent on his continued goodwill. To remain unmarried was, all too often, to remain without any secure place of one's own whatsoever. You have a fully secure place of your own, and there is no husband anywhere in the picture at all. The stone-solid safety her world dangled before every woman as marriage's chief reward, you have simply bought and hold outright yourself, and you answer to no one at all for the one door her world insisted led only through a wedding. You walk straight through it entirely on your own, key already in hand. So she stands quietly in your own home, deed held carefully in her hands, salts entirely forgotten somewhere nearby, taking in the full enormity of a woman who owns her own walls, entirely in her own name. To her, you possess the deepest form of security her own world had to offer, and you manage to obtain it without the marriage that was supposed to be its only possible price of admission. To you, it's simply your place, the home you personally bought and genuinely love living in. The property that once flowed only toward sons and husbands now sits squarely and permanently in a woman's own name, hers to keep for as long as she wishes. And of everything she has watched you do today, this particular thing feels to her less like a scandal, and rather more like a quiet promise she was never once told a woman could actually be made. Let's climb into your carriage now, except it has no horses attached to it at all. It roars to life beneath you, and you are the one driving it entirely alone, wherever you personally please to go that day. In the Regency world, a lady being driven somewhere by someone else was perfectly normal and expected, but the actual driving itself was generally understood as a man's task, and a woman controlling her own transport, entirely unaccompanied over any real distance, was simply not what her world expected of her under ordinary circumstances. That you operate an entire fast metal machine completely by yourself, choosing your own destination without asking anyone's permission or arranging any kind of escort beforehand, tells the lady watching that the very question of who is allowed to go where, and precisely how, has been answered entirely and unambiguously in your favor. Let her climb in beside you and marvel properly at the machine itself, before she even reaches the deeper scandal of who exactly is doing the driving. There are no horses anywhere involved, and yet the thing moves, and moves quite fast indeed, faster than any carriage she ever personally rode in her own lifetime, powered by some force she can neither see directly nor fully understand. It roars to life at a simple touch of your hand, and responds obediently to levers and pedals positioned beneath your own hands and feet. In her world, all transport meant animals, first and foremost, along with their careful ongoing care, their natural pace, and their real physical limits. You command an entirely different kind of force altogether, one with none of an animal's needs or limitations, and you command it with complete ease. And she is still busy recovering from the sheer horselessness of the whole thing when she remembers the far greater shock still waiting for her, that the one actually commanding this machine is you. Consider who typically did the driving in her own world, because it was very rarely, if ever, a lady of standing. A woman was, generally speaking, a passenger, conveyed carefully from place to place by a hired coachman or else by a male relative acting in that capacity. Her role was to be transported, rather than to actively transport herself anywhere at all. The actual handling of the vehicle, the careful control of the horses, the ongoing decisions about route and speed, all of this fell, by custom, squarely to men. A woman controlling her own conveyance entirely herself, especially over any real distance and especially while entirely alone, was simply not what her world expected of women in her position. You are not the passenger here at all. You are the driver, hands firmly on the controls, eyes fixed steadily on the road ahead, the whole powerful machine answering obediently to your own judgment alone. The role she was long ago assigned, you have simply set aside entirely without a second thought. Now the destinations themselves, chosen entirely, unilaterally by you. You don't request politely to be taken somewhere and then wait patiently for a man's agreement to the plan. You decide, quite simply, exactly where you're going, and then you go there, whether the destination happens to be near or far, familiar or entirely new to you, chosen on a whim or carefully planned out well in advance. In her world, a woman's movements were always carefully negotiated, dependent entirely on the availability of a driver and on the prior approval of whoever governed her outings that day. Your own movements depend on absolutely nothing but your own personal wish and a full tank of fuel. The question of exactly where a woman may go, once answered entirely by others on her behalf, is now answered every single time entirely by you alone. And the speed involved is the final flourish that genuinely undoes her composure completely. Not the careful, animal-limited pace of a traditional carriage, but real, genuine speed, the surrounding landscape rushing past you at distances that would once have required her a full hard day's travel by carriage, now folded neatly into a single easy hour. You choose that speed entirely yourself, faster or slower exactly as you please, fully in control of precisely how quickly the world rushes by around you. In her world, a woman had no hand whatsoever on the reins of her own velocity, whether literal or figurative. You hold that same control directly in your own two hands. You decide, personally, not only where you're headed, but also exactly how fast you'll get there. And the whole rushing power of the machine itself sits comfortably beneath your own steady grip. So she grips the edge of her seat tightly, salts entirely forgotten somewhere behind her, watching a thoroughly respectable woman command an entire roaring, horseless machine, completely alone, at real speed, toward a destination she chose herself, on her own personal authority. To her, you have seized total control over an entire domain, her own world reserved strictly for men, and you make it all look genuinely effortless in the process. To you, you're simply driving, running a quick errand, heading exactly where you please that afternoon. The question of who may go where, and how, and precisely how fast, once decided entirely over a woman's own head by others, has become, in your century, fully and completely hers alone to answer. And as the road rushes steadily past beneath your confident command, she feels something she never once felt in any carriage of her own lifetime. The particular, singular thrill of a woman going exactly where she personally wants to go, exactly as fast as she personally likes, purely because she herself decided it should be so. Now, here is where she very nearly loses the entire thread of the conversation completely. You pack a small bag, board an enormous machine that actually flies through the open air, and travel to an entirely foreign country, completely alone, purely for your own personal enjoyment. In the Regency era, travel of any real distance was slow, genuinely expensive, and for a gentlewoman, almost always carefully chaperoned, and typically justified only by real necessity rather than by simple personal pleasure. A woman journeying abroad entirely alone, purely for the simple joy of seeing somewhere new, would have been considered reckless at absolute best, and outright ruinous at worst, in her own social circle. That you do this quite casually, even posting cheerful photographs along the entire way for friends and family to see, thoroughly reshapes the lady's own private sense of just how large a woman's world is now genuinely allowed to be. Let her grapple properly with the flying itself first, because it genuinely precedes every other astonishment still waiting for her. You board a machine that lifts entirely off the solid ground and carries you steadily through open sky, across distances that would once have meant, in her own world, weeks of genuinely hard and often dangerous overland travel, and this remarkable machine accomplishes the entire journey in mere hours instead. She can scarcely bring herself to accept that people fly through the air at all, let alone that they do it so casually, seated comfortably in orderly rows, mildly bored, patiently waiting for a small in-flight meal to be served. Then she recalls the far greater marvel still waiting behind that one, that you are doing all of this entirely alone, and for no particular reason beyond the simple fact that you wanted to see somewhere genuinely new for yourself. And the flying itself suddenly becomes almost the very least remarkable part of the whole affair. Consider what travel of this kind cost a gentlewoman in her own world, both in raw effort and in social reputation simultaneously, because both costs were considerable. It was slow, quite expensive, and physically taxing in the extreme, and for a lady of standing it was hedged about tightly with rules at every turn. She rarely traveled any real distance without a proper chaperone at her side, and rarely traveled at all without some solid, respectable reason behind the journey, a family duty to fulfill, a marriage to attend, some genuine matter of necessity driving the whole trip forward. Travel undertaken purely for its own sake, purely for the simple pleasure of seeing new and unfamiliar places, was a freedom granted almost exclusively to young men undertaking their traditional grand tour of the continent. You travel for exactly that same reason, pure pleasure, and you travel entirely alone, completely unchaperoned, needing no justification whatsoever beyond your own simple curiosity about the wider world. Now the being alone part of it, which in her world would have represented the genuine ruin of the entire enterprise. An unchaperoned woman traveling abroad, in a foreign country full of complete strangers whose language she might not even speak fluently, would have been seen, in her world, as recklessly exposed to both real physical danger and serious social scandal simultaneously. The chaperone existed specifically to guard both her physical safety and her good name across every single unfamiliar mile of the journey. You cross those exact same unfamiliar miles with no guardian at your side whatsoever, navigating entirely strange cities purely on your own careful judgment. And you return home afterward, not ruined in any sense, but rather glowing with excitement, full of interesting stories to share with everyone. The vulnerability her world took as an absolute given, the very reason a lady never once traveled alone under any circumstances, has thinned considerably enough in your world that you now move through the entire wide world essentially on your own terms, whenever you personally choose to. And the cheerful, open record you keep of the entire journey is the final touch that genuinely reshapes her whole sense of a woman's world. You don't hide the journey afterward, nor downplay it in conversation. You post bright, cheerful photographs along the entire way, sharing the whole adventure openly with everyone. Visibly proud of the places you've personally seen and proud simply of the fact that you managed to see them entirely by yourself. In her world, a journey like this, if a woman dared attempt it at all, would have been something to carefully explain away afterward, to justify at length, perhaps even to feel quietly ashamed of admitting to. You broadcast the whole thing instead as a genuine joy and a real personal triumph, and everyone who happens to see the photographs simply thinks it all looks wonderful. The shame that would have shadowed her own steps every mile of such a journey is nowhere at all to be found shadowing yours. So she sits quietly, salts entirely abandoned somewhere in her lap, watching a thoroughly respectable woman fly clean across the entire world, completely alone, purely for fun, and share the whole delight of the experience openly without a single trace of fear or shame anywhere in it. To her, you have made the entire globe itself into a woman's personal playground, genuinely reachable, safe enough to explore, and entirely yours to wander through on your own terms. To you, it's simply a trip, a bag packed the night before, a flight caught the next morning, a new place seen and enjoyed. The narrow, tightly chaperoned, strictly necessity-bound travel her own world once permitted a woman has opened up entirely, in your century, into an entire planet a woman may freely cross alone, purely for the simple pleasure of doing so. And in grasping the true size of that open world, she finally begins to understand the real size a woman's whole life is now genuinely allowed to be. Let's talk now about power. Real power of a kind she never once held in her own lifetime, because you possess something she was never granted. You vote. Your voice counts exactly as much as any man's in choosing who governs the entire country, and no one can lawfully take that particular right away from you, under any circumstances whatsoever. In the Regency world, political power belonged entirely to a narrow slice of propertied men, and women had absolutely no formal say in government of any kind, regardless of their own intelligence, their family rank, or their personal wealth. The notion that your opinion on the nation's leadership might carry precisely the same weight as any man's opinion would have struck the lady watching as something close to a fantasy told to comfort small children. That it's simply your own ordinary, unremarkable right today leaves her genuinely, quietly stunned. Let her understand properly just how tightly political power was held in her own world, because the circle admitted was genuinely small indeed. The right to choose those who governed the country belonged, by law, to a narrow band of propertied men alone, and even among men generally, that right was far from universal or evenly distributed. Women, whatever their birth, their intelligence, or their fortune, stood entirely outside that circle without exception. A brilliant, wealthy, well-connected woman had, in the end, no more formal say in the nation's governance than the very poorest laborer in the land, which is to say, in practical terms, none whatsoever. Politics happened entirely over women's heads, decided in rooms women were simply not permitted to enter at all. You enter the modern equivalent of that very room, and you cast your own vote, and it genuinely, fully counts. Consider what it truly means that your voice carries precisely the same weight as any man's voice, not a lesser vote in any sense, not a voice merely filtered through a husband or a father's own opinion, a full and genuinely equal share in the choice, identical in weight to the vote cast by any man anywhere in the entire country. In her world, a woman's political influence, if she managed to have any at all, could only ever be exercised sideways, through the quiet, careful persuasion of whichever men actually held the real power. You need no such indirection whatsoever. You mark your own choice yourself privately, and it enters the final count as one full, complete voice among many millions, no different in weight from anyone else's vote. The plain, legal equality of it is what she keeps returning to, again and again. Now the security of the right itself, which she finds almost harder to believe than the underlying right's existence in the first place. It isn't a favor extended to you that might quietly be withdrawn later, nor a privilege dependent entirely on some man's continued goodwill toward you. It's your right, protected fully by law, and no one may lawfully strip it away from you under any circumstances at all. In her world, whatever small scraps of influence a woman managed to scrape together for herself were always informal and always revocable, held entirely at the pleasure of others around her. Your own say in the nation's governance rests, by contrast, on considerably firmer ground than that. It belongs to you as a genuine matter of legal right, not as a matter of anyone's permission, and the fact that it simply cannot be taken away strikes her as perhaps the most solid, dependable thing she's witnessed all day. And the sheer ordinariness of it to you personally is what leaves her most thoroughly stunned of all. You don't treat your vote as some kind of marvel, or as a hard-won prize to be celebrated. It's simply part of being a full adult, a thing you do periodically, without much ceremony attached to it, sometimes even grumbling faintly about the minor inconvenience of finding the time. In her world, this particular power sat so far beyond a woman's reach that to even promise it to her would have sounded rather like a fairy story told at bedtime. You hold it so casually that you occasionally forget entirely to feel its true weight. The fantasy that would once have comforted her like a story told to a child is, in your century, simply a Tuesday errand marked on a calendar somewhere between your other daily tasks. So she watches you exercise a power she never once dreamed a woman might actually hold, salts idle in her lap, quietly stunned by the sheer plainness of it all. To her, you possess an equal share in governing the entire nation, secured fully by law and thoroughly unremarkable to you personally. To you, it's simply your vote, one of the many ordinary rights of an entirely ordinary life. The political power that belonged in her world only to a narrow slice of propertied men now sits fully in your own hands, exactly as much as in anyone else's. And of everything she has witnessed today, this particular change may well reach the furthest of all, because it means a woman's opinion on the very largest matters that exist has finally, fully, been declared to genuinely count. Now let's discuss your education, which she finds almost too grand to properly believe. You attended a university. You studied advanced, demanding subjects alongside men in the very same halls and lecture rooms, and you hold a formal degree today that fully qualifies you for serious professional work of your own choosing. In the Regency era, a gentlewoman's education centered almost entirely on what were called accomplishments, skills meant primarily to help attract a suitable husband. Music, drawing, a smattering of French, elegant conversation, rather than any kind of rigorous academic study in the modern sense. The great universities of her day were, without exception, firmly closed to women entirely. That you sat formal examinations, mastered a genuinely difficult field of study, and hold a qualification recognized across the entire country, tells the lady watching that the doors she was once told to simply stop knocking on have, at long last, swung fully open. Let her recall what a gentlewoman's education was actually aimed at achieving in her own world, because it was aimed squarely and unmistakably at eventual marriage. A young lady learned accomplishments, the specific things that would make her genuinely pleasing to encounter in a drawing room and desirable as a future wife. A little music, played prettily enough to entertain guests, some drawing enough to sketch a pleasant landscape, a smattering of French for polite conversation, some graceful dancing, and the general art of light, agreeable conversation. These particular skills were meant to display her attractively, to help attract a genuinely good match, to ornament a household pleasantly. Deep, rigorous study of genuinely difficult subjects was thought entirely unnecessary for a woman, and possibly even harmful to her prospects. And in any case largely beside the real point, which was simply to be chosen by a suitable husband. You studied instead in order to know things for yourself, not in order to be chosen by anyone. Consider that you studied alongside men, too, in precisely the same halls, learning precisely the same demanding material side by side with them. In her world, the great universities functioned as genuine fortresses, closed firmly against women at every level, their advanced learning reserved exclusively for men who would go on afterward to the professions, and to the actual running of the wider world. A woman was not merely discouraged from pursuing that kind of learning in her world. She was formally barred outright from even the places where such learning actually happened. You walked into those very places as a simple matter of course, sat through the same demanding lectures, wrestled personally with the same genuinely difficult ideas, and were examined by precisely the same rigorous standards as everyone else around you. The fortress she was once told to stop even approaching, you simply entered directly, and no one standing at the gate so much as glanced your way twice. Now the degree itself, a formal qualification bearing your own full name, and recognized as legitimate across the entire country. It isn't merely a private accomplishment displayed quietly for guests in a parlor somewhere. It's a genuine public certification that you have mastered a serious, demanding field of study, weighed carefully, and formally stamped by the very same authorities that certify men in identical fields. In her world, a woman had no access whatsoever to this kind of formal recognition, no real way to have her own learning formally acknowledged and made genuinely useful out in the wider working world. Your own degree opens real doors for you, qualifies you directly for serious professional work, and stands as concrete proof of a trained, capable mind. The mere accomplishment she once gathered for herself could only ever be shown off privately. The formal qualification you earned actually does something concrete and useful out in the world, and the sheer difficulty of what you actually mastered is the part she can scarcely absorb properly. You didn't study something gentle and purely ornamental in nature. You took on a genuinely hard, demanding field of study, one that required real sustained effort, real intellect, and real persistence through material specifically designed to defeat anyone insufficiently prepared for it. In her world, women were very often thought entirely incapable of this kind of sustained intellectual rigor, or else considered too delicate for it by nature, or simply judged not worth the family's investment in the first place. You met that rigor head-on and prevailed against it fully, examinations passed, genuine mastery clearly proven. The old notion that a woman's mind was somehow unsuited to serious, demanding study has been thoroughly answered, in your century, by women who study the most serious subjects that genuinely exist, and excel at them completely. So she considers you now, salts entirely forgotten in her lap, a woman who entered the once closed fortress of higher learning, mastered a genuinely hard subject alongside men, and walked back out again holding a qualification recognized fully everywhere. To her, the doors she was once told to stop knocking on entirely have swung fully open, and women have simply, quietly walked straight through them. To you, it's simply your education, the specific field you personally chose, worked hard at, and genuinely earned for yourself. The purely ornamental accomplishments meant only to help catch a suitable husband have given way, in your century, to real, substantive learning aimed squarely at real, lasting professional capability. And watching you hold your own hard-earned degree, she finds herself thinking of every clever, capable girl in her own world, taught only ever to sketch and to play and to charm, and never once, not a single time, actually allowed to truly know. Let's approach a rather more delicate subject now, one she can barely bring herself to even properly name out loud. You speak plainly about your own body, its everyday workings, its ordinary needs, its monthly rhythms, out loud, even openly in mixed company, without lowering your voice or blushing yourself into embarrassed silence. In the Regency world, such matters were wrapped tightly in heavy discretion, discussed only ever in whispers among women themselves, if discussed at all, and never once acknowledged openly in polite mixed society. That you treat your own body as an entirely ordinary topic of conversation, spoken of with genuine frankness and even a touch of humor rather than with shame, strikes the lady watching as either genuinely shocking or deeply freeing. And once again, she genuinely cannot quite decide which of the two it truly is. Let her sit for a moment with the heavy silence her own world wrapped so tightly around such matters, because it was thick, and it lasted an entire lifetime. A woman's body, its ordinary workings, its everyday needs, was a subject sealed away tightly behind heavy layers of discretion. Its monthly rhythms, its natural changes, its ordinary discomforts were simply not spoken of aloud, scarcely even among women themselves in private, and never, under any circumstances, in mixed company of any kind. A lady was expected to manage all of it entirely invisibly, to give no outward sign whatsoever, to carry on as though her own body did nothing at all worth mentioning. The silence surrounding all this was so complete, in fact, that a young woman very often faced her own body's ordinary workings with little real preparation and considerable private confusion, simply because no one around her would speak of any of it plainly, even directly to her. Consider that you speak of these very things out loud, in perfectly ordinary tones, as though they were entirely ordinary, which of course, in the most basic sense, they genuinely are. You'll mention a monthly discomfort the exact same way you'd casually mention a passing headache. You'll name a bodily need without lowering your voice in the slightest. You'll discuss how your own body actually works with the same plain clarity you might bring to discussing any other everyday topic entirely. In her world, each one of these small, frank sentences would have represented a genuine scandal, a shocking breach of the discretion that governed a lady's entire relationship to her own physical body. You breach that old discretion constantly, and quite casually, and the sky, notably, does not fall as a result. The people around you simply nod along, because to them, too, it's genuinely just an ordinary fact of being a living person. Now the mixed company involved, which multiplies her alarm considerably at first, before quietly dissolving it again. It's one thing, perhaps, for women to speak of such matters privately among themselves alone, but you speak of them plainly where men can hear you too, and the men around you don't recoil in horror or blush the entire house down as a result. They receive the information calmly, as ordinary and unremarkable, sometimes even offering understanding of their own in return. The heavy wall that once stood firmly between what women privately knew about their own bodies and what could be openly acknowledged in front of men has simply come down entirely in your world. The knowledge itself is shared plainly, openly, common to everyone involved, rather than remaining a shameful secret that women once carried alone in whispered corners. And the underlying freedom beneath all this frankness is what she keeps quietly circling back to. The old silence of her world wasn't merely awkward to live with. It was genuinely isolating, and at times outright dangerous, leaving women poorly informed about their own bodies, unable to seek proper help plainly when they needed it, left entirely alone with confusions and fears they couldn't even properly name aloud to anyone. Your own openness undoes all of that entirely. Speaking plainly means understanding plainly. It means seeking help plainly when help is genuinely needed. It means meeting your own body with real knowledge instead of inherited shame. The frankness she first reads as genuinely shocking reveals itself, the longer she watches you, as something closer to real relief. A woman simply being allowed to know, and to name, and to speak the plain truth of the body she actually lives inside. So she watches you speak of your own body without a single flicker of shame anywhere on your face, salts idle in her lap, genuinely unable to decide whether to be scandalized by what she's hearing, or quietly moved by it instead. To her, you have shattered a silence her entire world enforced strictly, and you did it so easily that she can hardly believe the silence ever truly held anyone back at all. To you, it's simply honesty about an entirely ordinary fact of everyday life. The heavy discretion that once kept women whispering, poorly informed, and quietly ashamed has lifted entirely, in your century, into plain, unbothered, everyday speech. And the more she listens to you talk, the more she begins to quietly suspect that the silence she was once taught so carefully to keep never actually protected anyone at all, and that your own frankness, shocking as it first sounded to her ears, is in truth simply the kinder way to actually live inside a body. Now here's a choice she was very rarely, if ever, actually offered in her own lifetime. You may decide, deliberately and permanently, that you simply do not want children of your own, and the wider society around you largely accepts this as your own private business, and no one else's. In the Regency era, producing children, ideally sons above all, was very often regarded as a married woman's entire central purpose in life, and a wife who failed to bear children faced open pity, mounting pressure, and very often quiet blame heaped on her alone, regardless of the actual cause. The idea that a woman might simply prefer a different kind of life altogether, and have that stated preference genuinely respected by those around her, was simply not a real option on the table in her own world at all. That you can say no plainly, mean it fully, and go on to build a complete and thoroughly honored life for yourself regardless, quietly reorders the lady's entire understanding of what a woman is fundamentally even for. Let her recall what childbearing actually meant for a woman's sense of purpose in her own world, because it was very often taken to be the entire whole of that purpose, with little else besides. A wife was expected, as a matter of basic course, to produce children and sons above all others, in order to carry the family name forward and secure the family line for future generations. This expectation wasn't understood in her world as merely one path among several equally valid ones. It was understood as the central, defining reason for a woman's entire married existence in the first place. A wife who successfully bore children fulfilled her assigned role completely. One who did not, for whatever underlying cause, was pitied, quietly pressured, and very often silently blamed, as though she alone had somehow failed at the very task she was specifically made for. The purpose itself was simply assigned to her at birth, never freely chosen, and a woman was measured against it constantly, whether she personally willed any of it or not. Consider that you may simply decline the whole matter, deliberately, and for good, not merely delaying the decision, nor struggling privately and failing at it, but choosing clearly and permanently that a life built around children simply isn't the life you personally want for yourself. In her world, a choice of this kind was scarcely even imaginable, because childbearing was never really framed as a genuine choice at all in the first place, but rather as duty and destiny fused together into one single inseparable thing. You framed the entire matter as a genuine personal preference instead, one valid option among several others equally available to you, and you select a different path entirely for yourself. The idea that a woman might look honestly at motherhood, understand it fully and clearly, and then decide plainly that it isn't for her, without any accompanying tragedy attached and without any need for apology whatsoever, sits far outside anything her own world ever genuinely offered women in her position. Now the acceptance that greets your own choice, which astonishes her nearly as much as the underlying choice itself does. You say no plainly, and the surrounding society, by and large, treats the matter as entirely your own private affair to decide as you see fit. There's no chorus of open pity directed at you, no relentless ongoing pressure to reconsider your decision, no lasting verdict of personal failure hanging permanently over your head as a result. Your own family may privately wish things were otherwise, perhaps, but the final decision itself is fully understood by everyone involved to be entirely yours alone to make. In her world, a childless woman was very often treated as a genuine problem, one that others around her felt fully entitled to comment on, to correct, and to openly grieve over on her behalf. In your world, your own reproductive life is regarded, by contrast, as squarely your own private business, and a woman who genuinely wants a different sort of life is largely permitted to simply have it, unharried by those around her. And the genuinely full life you go on to build instead is the part that finally reorders her deepest underlying sense of what a woman is actually for. Choosing against having children doesn't leave your own life empty or somehow purposeless as a result. You fill your days instead with meaningful work, with real love, with genuine friendship, with travel, with 100 other meaningful things besides. And this full life is honored fully by those around you as a whole and thoroughly worthy life, entirely complete on its own separate terms. In her world, a woman's basic worth was bound so tightly to motherhood specifically that a life lived without it seemed, almost by definition, an unfinished life. You demonstrate, simply by living well and fully, that a woman's true purpose is genuinely hers alone to define for herself, and that a full, complete life need not necessarily run through the nursery at all in order to count as such. So she watches you live out a rich, fully honored life that you chose freely for yourself, salts entirely forgotten somewhere in her lap, quietly absorbing the fact that a woman may decline motherhood outright and be neither pitied for it nor diminished by it in any lasting way. To her, you have refused the one central purpose her own world assigned automatically to every woman, and you have lost genuinely nothing at all by refusing it. To you, it's simply the particular life you personally wanted, chosen freely, built carefully, and thoroughly enjoyed along the way. The central duty that once defined a married woman's entire existence in her world has become, in your century, merely one option among many others, freely taken up by some, or just as freely left aside by others, with no shame attached to either path. And in watching you live your own chosen life so fully, she finally begins to see, perhaps for the first time in her own existence, that a woman was truly never meant for any single fixed thing at all, only ever for whatever life she herself genuinely chooses to build. And so, at last, we come to the final one, the one she never once dared even privately dream about in her own lifetime. Should your marriage, if you ever have one, happen to make you genuinely unhappy, you can simply end it. You can walk away entirely, keeping your own name if you wish to reclaim it, your own money earned through your own work, your own home, and go on afterward to live a good and thoroughly respected life all on your own. In the Regency world, divorce was staggeringly rare, obtainable in full only through a specific act of Parliament, ruinously expensive for nearly everyone, and genuinely catastrophic for a woman's reputation and finances alike should she ever attempt it. Most unhappy wives, faced with these realities, simply endured their circumstances silently for the remainder of their lives. That you can leave a genuinely bad marriage behind and go on to thrive afterward, rather than simply vanish quietly into social disgrace, is the precise moment the lady watching finally sets down her smelling salts for good, looks at you fully and directly, and wonders, just for one brief heartbeat, whether she herself might have simply been born into the wrong century entirely. Let her recall properly what a genuinely bad marriage actually meant in her own world, because it very often meant, in practical terms, a full life sentence with no real possibility of parole. Full divorce was so exceedingly rare in her day as to be nearly mythical, obtainable only through a special, individually granted Act of Parliament, at a cost that few families could ever realistically dream of paying, and shadowed permanently by social ruin for any woman it happened to touch, however unfairly. For most unhappy wives in her world, a bad marriage was simply endured, year after difficult year, with no real door leading out of it whatsoever. A cruel husband, a cold one, or a reckless one, was understood as a fate to be quietly survived, rather than one that could genuinely be escaped. The marriage vow, once made, closed firmly around a woman for the entire remainder of her natural life, and both the law and the wider world alike fully expected her to remain inside it, regardless of whatever personal cost that continued confinement might ultimately demand of her. Consider that you can simply end an unhappy marriage outright, and end it cleanly, without the whole affair destroying your life in the process. If your own marriage happens to make you genuinely unhappy, you may leave it through a legal process that is realistically available, genuinely survivable, and open equally to ordinary people, rather than being reserved exclusively for the wealthy and the truly desperate. In her world, the door leading out barely existed at all in any practical sense, and it destroyed nearly anyone who tried to force it open regardless. In yours, the door is entirely real, genuinely usable, and passed through calmly, without catastrophe, by countless ordinary people every single year, who then simply go on afterward with the rest of their lives. That an unhappy wife might have a genuine, dignified way out available to her, rather than facing only silent endurance for the remainder of her days, is a basic mercy that her own world withheld from nearly every woman who ever truly needed it. Now consider, too, what you get to keep with you on your way out, because that particular detail astonishes her most of all. You leave with your own name intact, reclaiming it fully if you wish to. You leave with your own money, earned entirely through your own work and held safely in your own private account, entirely untouched by the ending of the marriage itself. You leave with your own home, or else with the genuine means to build a new one for yourself. Your basic security remains fully intact throughout the entire process, because it was, in truth, always genuinely yours to begin with, never truly dependent on the marriage in the first place. In her world, a woman leaving a marriage, in the vanishingly rare event she could manage it at all, stood to lose absolutely everything she had in the process: her social standing, her financial means, her very place within respectable society. You lose none of the truly essential things, because your own life was never wholly folded into your husband's life in the first place, not even during the marriage itself. And the fully continued life you go on to build afterward is the part that finally makes her set down her salts for good, once and for all. You don't simply vanish quietly into disgrace, whispered about at a distance, and cast out entirely from polite company. You go on instead, respected, gainfully employed, financially secure, entirely free to love again someday if you choose to, or not to exactly as you personally prefer, your own future still fully laid out ahead of you regardless of what came before. In her world, a woman touched by divorce was understood as ruined permanently, past any hope of real recovery. In yours, the ending of a marriage is understood, by contrast, as simply a difficult chapter in a much longer story, never the actual end of the book itself. And a woman may close that particular chapter firmly behind her and go on afterward to write a great many more chapters still, entirely on her own terms. That a woman might genuinely survive the ending of a marriage, and not merely survive it but actually go on to thrive afterward, represents perhaps the single freedom her own world denied to women most completely of all, more thoroughly even than any of the freedoms that came before it tonight. So she sets down her smelling salts finally and fully and looks at you directly, taking you in completely at last. A woman who could, if she ever needed to, leave an unhappy marriage behind entirely and keep her own name, her own money, her own home, and her entire future fully intact throughout the whole process. To her, you hold the one true escape her own world sealed permanently shut against every woman she ever knew, and you hold it today as though it were simply an ordinary, unremarkable right belonging to you. To you, it's simply the quiet knowledge that you are never truly trapped, that a bad marriage is a thing you can survive fully and leave behind entirely, and go on living well afterward regardless. The life sentence her own world once handed down to every unhappy wife has become, in your century, merely a chapter a woman may close firmly behind her, and then go on to fully outlive. And so, at long last, our Regency lady sits quietly at the very edge of your ordinary life, her smelling salts finally, completely forgotten in her lap, having watched you do what must genuinely feel to her like 100 impossible things before dinner alone. She has watched you sleep peacefully by yourself in a warm and enormous bed. She has watched you dress yourself completely in barely 40 unbothered seconds. She has watched you walk out into the wide world with no chaperone at your side and no real fear in your heart. She has watched you earn your own money and keep every coin of it fully for yourself. She has watched you buy your own home outright and hold the keys to it proudly in your own two hands. She has watched you drive yourself anywhere at all, at whatever speed genuinely pleases you. She has watched you cross the entire wide world alone, purely for the simple joy of doing so. She has heard you laugh freely with your whole chest, curse cheerfully at stubborn furniture, speak plainly and without shame about your own body, and cast your own vote as though your voice genuinely weighed exactly as much as any man's, which, at long last in your world, it truly does. She came here tonight fully expecting to be scandalized, and scandalized at various points along the way, she genuinely was. But somewhere between the trousers and the divorce, somewhere in the long, quiet accumulation of all these small, ordinary freedoms, the scandal in her own heart slowly turned into something else entirely, something considerably closer to real wonder. Because everything she guarded so carefully throughout her own entire life, her pale, protected skin, her carefully governed speech, her spotless and endlessly supervised reputation, was in truth only ever armor built up patiently against a world that offered women almost nothing else to rely on. And you, without ever quite pausing to notice it yourself, simply live each day inside a world that has quietly given women almost everything she was once so firmly told to stop wanting for herself. So tonight, as you settle in beneath your own soft blankets in your own home, behind a door that only you may lock, spare a small, gentle thought for her, and for every clever, corseted woman who spent her one and only life being carefully watched and dutifully married off, and quietly told to laugh only ever behind a raised fan. They endured an entire world with its doors bolted firmly shut against them. And somehow, even so, they still hoped. They still loved, in whatever small ways were left open to them. They still quietly dreamed of something wider, something freer, for the daughters who would one day come after them. You are those daughters, grown now into the world they only ever dared to imagine from a distance. The doors, at long last, stand open. Rest easy tonight and sleep well in the one century they could only ever quietly dream of.